So I just muted everyone. Okay.
We start
10:32.
Should 10:30 or should wait to 10:35 to more people come in, or whatever people think?
I think
We'll be meditating.
All right. Because well, the thing is, I want to make sure about this privacy thing that people have to hear it about. Well, I can wait that part till we do questions, and then let me make an announcement about that. How's that sound?
Sounds good.
Okay. Yes, yeah, let's get started. So, all right. Hello, my name is Steve, and I'd like to welcome everybody to this Daylong with Tana, Ajaan, and Geoff. This event is sponsored by the Sati Center for Buddhist Studies and the San Francisco Bay Area Parisā. The San Francisco Bay Area Parisā is a group of Tana Ajaan students in the Bay Area, although we have members all over the world who join us for our various meetings. There's going to be opportunity for questions after Tana Ajaan gives his first talk in the morning, and I'll give some instructions about that because there's certain things I want instructions to give to protect people's privacy, because this will be put on the internet. So now it's my great privilege to introduce Tana Ajaan Geoff. By my calculations, Tana Ajaan Geoff has been doing a day long at the Sati Center for 23 or 24, this is 23rd or 24th time, dating back to the late 90s. A little about Tana Ajaan. After graduating from Oberlin in 1979 with a degree in European intellectual history, he studied meditation under Ajahn Fuang Chatiko in Thailand and ordained in 1976. In 1991, he helped establish Meta Forest Monastery in San Diego County, California, where he is the abbot. He's a prolific writer and translator, and many of his work can be found on www.dharmatalks.org. So with that, welcome Tana, Geoff.
Okay, thank you. Let's start with a little bit of meditation first. My teacher once said, if you want people to understand the Dharma, get them to meditate first, and it's a lot easier to talk to them then. So close your eyes. Get in a comfortable position. And start with thoughts of goodwill. Goodwill is a wish for happiness, true happiness. Because true happiness comes from within. When you have goodwill for yourself, it's not selfish. You're basically saying, may I understand the causes for true happiness and be willing and able to act on them. Propose that thought in your mind. And then spread it to others. Start with people who are close to your heart, your family, your very close friends. May they find true happiness too. And then spread that thought out in ever widening circles to people you know, well, and like. To people you like, even though you don't know them so well. Anthology, is the recording button on? Got it. Spread thoughts of goodwill to people you're more neutral about. And to people you don't like. Remember, the world would be a much better place if we could all find true happiness within. And spread thoughts of goodwill to people you don't even know. Not just people, living beings of all kinds, east, west, north, south, above and below, out to infinity. May we all find true happiness in our hearts. Now bring attention to the breath. Take some good long, deep in and out breaths. And notice where you feel the breathing in the body. Where it's most obvious, focus your attention there. And then ask yourself if the breath is comfortable. If long breathing feels good, keep it up, but otherwise you can experiment. Try even longer breathing, or shorter, faster, slower, heavier, lighter, deeper, or more shallow. Experiment for a while to see what rhythm and texture of breathing feels best for the body right now. Any pains in the body, you don't have to pay them attention. Focus on the areas of the body that you can make comfortable by the way you breathe. As for distracting thoughts, they come in, they can go. You don't have to follow them. You don't have to keep tabs on them. If you do find that you followed one away from the breath, just drop it, and you'll find yourself right back at the breath. No matter how many times it happens, just keep dropping the thought and be back at the breath. Every time you come back to the breath, reward yourself with a breath that feels really good. It's one of the ways in which you can maintain interest in the breath. Now, as the breath gets comfortable, there may be a tendency for the mind to focus on the comfort rather than the breath, in which case you begin to zone out. So to counteract that tendency, the next step is to breathe in and out aware of the whole body. And a good way to build up to that whole body awareness is to go through the body first, section by section, to familiarize yourself with how the breathing feels in different parts of the body, where it's not so obvious. A good place to begin is down around the navel. Locate that part of the body in your awareness. Watch it for a while as you breathe in, breathe out, to see what rhythm of breathing feels good there. And if you notice any tension or tightness in that part of the body, allow it to relax. So no new tension builds up as you breathe in. You're not holding on to any tension as you breathe out. Move your attention up to the solar plexus and follow the same 3 steps there. In other words, 1, locate that part of the body in your awareness. 2, watch it for a while as you breathe in, breathe out to see what rhythm of breathing feels good there. And 3, if there's any sense of tension or tightness in that part of the body, allow it to relax. Now move your attention up to the middle of the chest and follow the same steps there. Now bring attention to the base of the throat and follow the same steps there. The 3 steps are: 1, locate that part of the body in your awareness. 2, watch it for a while to see what rhythm of breathing feels good there. And then 3, if there's any tension or tightness in that part of the body, allow it to relax. Now bring your attention to the middle of the head. As you breathe in, think of the breath energy coming in not only through the nose, but also through the eyes and the ears. From the back of the neck down from the top of the head, going deep into the brain. And as you breathe out, think of it radiating out from the head in all directions, working through any patterns of tension you may have around the temples, the forehead, the eyes, the jaws, the neck. And gently dissolving those patterns of tension away. You can continue the rest of the survey of the body at your own pace. Down the shoulders, out the arms, down the back, out the legs. Going through the body as many times as you like until you're ready to settle down. At which point you can choose any one spot where it feels most congenial to stay focused. Settle your attention there and then think of it spreading from that spot to fill the whole body. See where the whole body breathing in, the whole body breathing out. And then just maintain that sense of centered but broad awareness. It may have a tendency to shrink, especially on the out breath. So keep reminding yourself, whole body as you breathe in, whole body as you breathe out. If your focus begins to get blurry, you can go back to the survey of the body again. And while you're meditating, I'll give the talk. There's a passage in the canon where some monks are leaving to go to a far distant country where people don't know much about Buddhism. So they go to say goodbye to the Buddha. And he says, have you paid your respects to Sarvabhuta? I say, well, no, we haven't. So you go pay your respects to him. So they do. And he asks them, the people in that far distant land are known to be wise. And if they ask you, what does your teacher teach? What are you going to tell them? And the monk said, well, we would have come a long ways to hear what you would tell them. So the very first thing that Sarvabhuta says is, our teacher teaches the ending of passion. No mention of Four Noble Truths, no mention of the three characteristics, the ending of passion, because that's the goal of practice. It's through ending of clinging, ending of craving, ending of passion, that the end of suffering is brought about. And it's good to keep that in mind, that all the teachings the Buddha gave are for the sake of ending clinging, ending passion. And so when we think about the topic of not self, which is the topic for today, the question is how best to approach this topic and how best to use it in a way that leads to the ending of clinging. Right up front, I want to say, in case Zoom goes down and you want the takeaway right away, the takeaway is that when the Buddha is talking about not self, he's not saying there is no self. He never, of course, says that there is a self. Basically, it comes down to saying what you are is not the problem. The problem is clinging to your ideas of what you are. And so they're not self-teaching. This best meant as a tool to approach that issue of clinging. And what's interesting about it, even though your ideas about what you are part of the problem of leading to suffering, we're going to be using your ideas of what you are as part of the solution. So when the Buddha was asked, is there a self, is there no self? He didn't answer. There are two passages that are relevant here. One was when a wanderer named Vachagotha came to the Buddha and asked him that question point blank. Another is where the Buddha is actually talking to the monks as a large group. Sound is muffled. See if that's any better. Okay. With Vachagotha, the wanderer, he asked the question, the Buddha remained silent. So Vachagotha got upset and left. Ananda, who was sitting by, asked the Buddha, why didn't you answer him? The Buddha gives four answers to Ananda. One of which is that if I'd said, yes, there is a self, I'd be siding with the eternalists. If I said there was no self, I'd be siding with the annihilationists. Now, those are two groups of people who the Buddha had extreme wrong views. He went on to say, if I said there is a self, would that be in line with the teaching that all dhammas are not self? No. And if I said there is no self, then this poor wanderer would have been confused. Does the self I used to have no longer exist? So the Buddha doesn't give an explanation more than that. It is interesting, though, that he doesn't say that either way. There is a self, there is no self. He's basically saying, no matter how you define a self, no matter what you say about whether there is or is not a self, it's going to lead to problems. It's going to lead to wrong view. We'll get into a little bit later what some of these issues are. The other instance where the Buddha was talking about the issue, this time he was talking not just to the wanderer, he was talking to the monks at large. He's basically saying there are certain questions that are simply not worth paying attention to. And among the questions that are not worth paying attention to are questions like, do I exist? Do I not exist? What am I? How am I? Buddha says you try to answer these questions, you end up either with the views that you have a self or that you don't have a self, which he calls a tangle of views, a wilderness of views, a writhing of views. You get entangled with these views and you're not set free. So the whole purpose of the teaching has to be something else. besides just coming on to the question of whether there is or is not a self. And it's good to look at some of the consequences, though, of saying, yes, there is a self, or no, there is no self. Why the Buddha would want to avoid answering those questions. Basically, when you say, yes, there is a self, that whatever you say it is, whether it's permanent or impermanent, form or formless, is going to become an object of attachment. There's a passage in Dika Nikaya 15 where the Buddha lists the various ways in which self can be defined, either as having a form and finite, having a form and infinite, formless and finite, formless and infinite. That pretty much covers all the ground. In each of those cases, you can say either the self already is that way, or it can be made to be that way, or naturally become that way, say when you go to sleep or when you die. So those 3 modes times 4 types of self, it gives you 12 self-views that you can go for. And the Buddha puts them all aside. He says, you look at the way they define the self, and none of them really worth going with. Now notice that it's a value judgment he's making here. But I want to make this point again and again throughout the day. That the Buddha is not, he's less interested in talking about what you are, but talking about the value judgment of whether something is worth claiming to be self or not self. Now, the consequences of saying, no, there is no self. One, you can round up with the question of, well, who's doing the practice then? And who are we doing this for? There was a study made years back of infant behavior. And the psychologists noticed that one of the things that makes children the happiest, especially little tiny children, is when they figure out they can do something and they get a result, and they do it again and they get the same result. And this is why children start banging away on something and it drives you crazy. But for them, it's not just the sound. It's the fact that they've learned something about causality. They've learned something that they have some power to have an influence on their environment. And this is the main source of delight for infants. And we'll see that this sense of agency is going to be important for doing the path. Because as the Buddha said, you want to be able to delight in abandoning unskillful qualities and to delight in developing skillful qualities. And this quality of delight does not happen when you feel that you are powerless to make a difference. In fact, if you feel that you're powerless, you cannot make a difference through your choices, it leads to depression. Whereas the Buddha is making this, it says the path to the end of suffering has to be a path that you delight in. So that's the first consequence of saying there is no self. It calls into question the whole question of who's doing the practice, who's going to benefit from it. Secondly, if you have the view there is no self, what do you do with it? It's kind of a view that you set forth, and then you take on all comers, you argue with other people, and then you have to get attached to it. Another consequence of calling into question of who's acting and who's going to receive the results of the action is that it becomes a license for irresponsibility. There was a case in Majjhima 109 where the Buddha is talking about how the aggregates are not self. And a monk comes up with this question. If the aggregates are not self, then what self is going to be affected by the actions done by what is not self? In other words, there's no agent and there's going to be nobody receiving it. You can do what you want. So to say there is no self can also be used as an excuse for irresponsibility. You also have the practical problem is that when people meditate and they arrive at a blank state, they convince themselves that they've achieved awakening. The idea that once you see there is no self, that is awakening. And then they get stuck at that level. There's also the problem of people saying that, believing that if you arrive at the view that there is no self, then you are awakened. Again, the Buddha never talks about views as being what you arrive at. Even right view is a means to the end. It's part of that raft that goes across the river. That has to be abandoned when you get to the other side. So these are some of the reasons, I think, why the Buddha would not want to say there is no self, or would not want to say there is a self. It's a question that he puts aside. You have to understand, when he puts a question aside, what does that mean? He saw that there were 4 ways of answering questions. The first is called categorical, which is where you basically say yes or no across the board. There's the analytical, when you have to define the terms. In this case, if you say we're going to give an analytical answer to the question of whether there is or is not a self, you would have to say, well, how do you define self? What do you mean when you say self? Third type of question is counter-questioning. In other words, before you give an answer to a question, you ask some questions of the person who's asking the question to make sure he's going to understand or she is going to understand the answer when you give it. And then the fourth is question you just put aside because it's not conducive to the end of suffering. Apology, Steve, people are asking for closed caption. Do you have it?
Apology?
I'm going to look, I'm going to see if it is possible.
We should have it. Just gonna figure out where it is.
I just don't know. Yeah, I'm looking for it.
Someone said it's under apps.
Okay. Yeah. I'll go ahead and try to see if it is possible for me to enable through the computer. And meanwhile, Ajaan, you may want to continue. I'll try to see.
Okay. So when the Buddha was putting this question aside, it meant not only did he not want to give a straight yes or no answer to it, he also did not want to give an analytical answer. And this is an important point because all too often, this is what we're told, that the Buddha would give an analytical answer to the question. In other words, he would say that yes, you do have a certain kind of self, and no, you don't have another certain kind of self. There are three main theories that you hear, or at least that I'm aware of, and I'd like to go over them. This is important to realize that they actually misrepresent what the Buddha said. The first one is basically says that what the Buddha was negating was the Upanishadic idea of the self. We know that in the Upanishads, they had the theory of the self as being equal to the cosmos, or equal to the principle behind the cosmos. And so that this was specifically the view that the Buddha was negating. He wasn't negating your ordinary sense of you as a separate person. Now, the problem here is that it turns out there is not just one Upanishadic view of the self. Remember, I listed those 12 views just now. The self is finite in form, having a form, infinite, having a form, finite and formless, infinite and formless. And that each of those three can be multiplied either by you already are that way, you will become that way naturally at death, or you can make yourself to be that way, which gives you 12 types of views. Out of those 12 types of views, you can find 8 of them in the Upanishads. So the Upanishads were not speaking with one voice on what the self is. And also the Buddha himself never said that the self had to be permanent to qualify as a self. So that's one analytical interpretation that is actually misrepresents what the Buddha said. Second one is that he's saying that no, you don't have a separate individual self, but yes, you do have a cosmic or interconnected self. But again, as we said, that the Buddha negated all kinds of ways that you could define yourself. No matter how you define yourself, it can become an object of attachment. You're going to attach to a permanent self and a temporary self just as well. Attach to a temporary self just as much as you can to a permanent self. You're going to attach to an interconnected self just as much as you can to a separate self. And then you run into the added problems. If you are part of this interconnected whole, it means that you cannot gain awakening until everybody else gains awakening. This would mean that the Buddha himself never really gained awakening. And that we have to wait for everybody, even our political leaders, to get awakening before we could get anywhere, which I don't think is going to happen anytime soon. And it turns out the Buddha actually ridiculed the idea of a cosmic self in no uncertain terms. He says, wherever there's a sense of self, there has to be the idea of what belongs to self. And if you were the cosmos, it would mean that everything belongs to you. Is that the case? Well, no. You go take your neighbor's car out of his garage and drive down the street, he's not going to be happy. You can't say, well, this is my car. Nobody's going to recognize that. So that's another view that the Buddha put aside. He's not saying that, yes, there is a cosmic or interconnected self, and no, there's no separate self. That's not one of his answers. The third interpretation is one that's similar to the first. This is the one that you actually find within some of the old Buddhist texts themselves, and it's still promoted nowadays. If there's something to be a self, it has to be permanent. What you are is the aggregates. The aggregates are impermanent, and therefore you don't have a self. That has some of the same problems that we've encountered with the other two. In other words, the Buddha is basically saying across the board, you don't answer yes or no to the question whether there's a self. But then you also come up with a separate issue, which is the Buddha many times in the canon will be talking about self. We'll be seeing, we'll discuss later in the day. He talks about making yourself your mainstay, making yourself your governing principle, depending on yourself, using this concepts of I and mine. What, when I do it, will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness. When I do this action, what are the results going to be? You use the concept of I, you use the concept of self quite often. The Buddha does that. So when he's talking about in terms of self, and there really is no self, is he lying? It was to answer this question that they came up with the theory of two truths. The idea being that on a conventional level, there is a self, but on an ultimate level, there is no self. But that's the same as saying that the Buddha would speak in terms of what we call useful fictions. And the Buddha himself had said many, many times, there is no such thing as a useful fiction. The idea that something could be untrue but beneficial, he had no space for that in his concept of speech. You also have the problem, which is that if you are just your aggregates, then what happens to you at Nibbana? The aggregates end. Would Nibbana then be annihilation? The Buddha was very clear that this Nibbana was not annihilation. Finally, one of the arguments is given to bolster this idea. So there's a passage in Majjhima 148 when the Buddha said, you can look at the different aggregates, take feeling as an example. You look at your feelings, you can see them arising, you can see them passing away. Therefore, you don't see that they are worthy of being called self. This, the argument says, proves that the Buddha felt that the idea of a self must refer to something permanent. But I think the Buddha here is getting at something else. As we already saw, that he has no use for any theory of self, whether it's permanent or impermanent, finite or infinite. But what he is saying in Majjhima 148 is, if you see something arise, that can't be you, because you have to be there before it arises. The same way, if you see something passing away, it can't be you, because you're there after it passes away. So this means that we don't have to define self as something permanent. But the Buddha's getting down to is no matter how you answer that question, do I have a self, do I not have a self? It's going to get you tied up in all kinds of problems. Which leads to the next question. Well, if the Buddha's not answering that question, what is the question he is answering? And the answer is the question that lies at the basis of discernment, which is, what, when I do it, will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness? What, when I do it, will lead to my long-term harm and suffering? In other words, discernment or wisdom here is framed in terms of actions for which you are responsible and for which you will benefit. So in that case, we look at self not so much as a thing, but as an activity. Your activity of creating your sense of self, your perception of self. And then the question becomes, what, when I do it, what sense of self is useful, will lead to long-term welfare and happiness? What sense of not self will lead to long-term welfare and happiness? In the sense of you're being responsible, You can see this very clearly in the Buddha's instruction to Rahula. When he introduced Rahula to the Dharma, and this sutta, Mantra 161, Sutta, Mantra 61, is an important one. The Buddha is laying out all the basic principles of the practice to his son. And one of them is he has the son look at his actions before he does them. This is an action he intends to do while he's doing them, after they're done. And in each case, he uses the concept of I, this action that I intend to do, this action that I am doing, this action that I have done. The sense of I is very important there. You're taking responsibility for your actions. So it does play an important role in the path, but you have to use it as a tool. As we'll find out, you use the sense of self on the path, and you get to a point where, sorry, I'm watching messages buzzing by. You get to the point where you don't need it anymore, and that's when you drop all senses of self. But in the meantime, you use it as a means. You create a more healthier sense of self that is capable of following the path and is going to benefit from following the path. You use that as your motivation. You use your sense of responsibility to look at your actions, to be responsible for your actions. And it's in this way that you can actually follow the path. So basically what the Buddha is wanting you to see how you create your sense of self as you do this. This is going to give you a lot of insight into the actions that you do, the things that you cling to, and enables you to get past them. So again, he wants you to see you create your sense of self as an action. So if we get involved in questions about what you actually are, it actually distracts attention from the big question, which is the question of action, of how you define yourself. Because as the Buddha said, how you define yourself, you end up, however you define yourself, you limit yourself. Except for the case of how you define yourself around the path. So now the questions become, what perceptions of self are conducive to long-term well-being and happiness? And when are they skillful? And what perceptions of not self are conducive to long-term well-being and happiness? And when are they skillful? And here we look at the Four Noble Truths. If you want to understand any of the Buddhist teachings, you have to put them in the context of the Four Noble Truths. In this particular case, questions of self and not self, perceptions of self and not self, play different roles depending on which truth you're focused on. Start with the first and second Noble Truths. You're going to be using the perception of not self as part of a program to get rid of clinging and craving for the sake of dispassion. You note here, dispassion is a value judgment. You're applying these perceptions to see, is this something worth holding on to? And when you arrive at dispassion, you come to the point where you say, no, it's not worth it. So ultimately, you're going to get to the point where everything is not worth holding on to. However, in the third Noble Truth, you're going to be letting go of all perceptions, which means that in that case, you can't have perceptions of self or not self. If you hold on to either of those perceptions at that point, it prevents you from realizing third Noble Truth, which is the cessation of suffering. As for the fourth Noble Truth, you'll find that you will be using perceptions of self and not self selectively. Your sense of self will still have a value here. After all, you are creating a sense of self all the time anyhow, through the process of becoming, in which you focus on a desire, develop a sense of you as the person who might be able to attain the desired object, and you as the person who will enjoy having the object. And then you as the commentator watching yourself as you're doing this. And this is the process of becoming. You're already doing it. So the Buddha says, well, let's put it to use. Put it to use to help develop virtue, put it to use to help develop concentration, to help develop discernment. So in this case, the self still has value here, so you don't drop it, but you do train it to be more skillful. Until you reach the point where you have to apply the perception of not self to everything, and then you drop that too. Think of the image of the raft. You're going to take the raft across the river. You're on this side of the river. There are trees on this side of the river, but there's a lot of danger here. The other side of the river is safe. And so you take the trees from this side of the river, and you take the twigs and take the branches and tie them up and make them a raft. And then you hold on to that raft and you go across the river. And then when you get to the other side, once you reach the other shore, you don't need the raft anymore. In fact, it would be stupid, the Buddha said, to carry it on your head. So you leave the raft there and then you go on your way. So in the same way, you're going to be using your perceptions of self as part of that raft. Because after all, what's the raft made out of? It's made of things you've got on this side of the river, twigs and branches. You can't sit there and wait for the Nibbana yacht to come and pick you up and take over. So you have to make the raft yourself out of what you've got. So you take what you've got, you try to make it as skillfully put together as possible, and you take it across, then you put it aside. So you're going to need the perceptions of not self for the first and second noble truth. You're going to need the perceptions of self and not self for the fourth. In other words, the self that will be doing the path, benefiting from it. And not self is a perception you apply to anything that would pull you off the path. And then finally, for the third noble truth, when you finally arrive at the end of suffering, you have to let go of all perceptions. And that includes perceptions of self and not self. So the Buddha had pinned down an answer to the question of, is there a self or is not a self? He wouldn't have been able to use these strategies in this way. So this is why that particular question gets in the way of our goal here, which is to put an end to clinging. Now, these strategies of self and not self, actually, these are things that we're doing all the time already. Wherever you define a sense of self, there's going to be a sense of not self outside of the boundary. It's just that we tend to be pretty erratic in how we do this. So if you could take a picture of your sense of self as you go through the day, it would be like reflections on skittering across water, or an amoeba moving here, moving there, taking different shapes. Sometimes you have the shape of a human being, sometimes an animal, sometimes just a shapeless blob. But your sense of self keeps changing. You have many different selves. And this is an important point to realize. We're not just trying to get rid of one self here. We're trying to look at all our different strategies for happiness, because that's what self is. It's a strategy. Trying to figure out what is worth holding on to, what you have control over, so that you can find happiness. And so, depending on the desire that you have, you will be identifying with different things and dropping other things. In other words, you'll be selfing some things and not selfing other things. Think about when you were a child. Suppose you have a baby sister. The kids down the street are going to beat her up. So you go down and you save her, you protect her, because after all, she is your sister. You come home and she takes one of your toys and starts playing with it and won't give it back. Well, in this case, she's not your sister anymore. She's the enemy. And this is the sort of thing we do all the time, defining ourselves in different ways depending on what we want. What the Buddha is having us do here as part of the path is say, okay, focus on wanting one thing really sincerely, which is the end of suffering, and learn how to be more systematic in how you choose to identify yourself and disidentify yourself so that you can actually attain that goal. So again, the focus here is not so much on what you are, but it's what kind of identity you take on. Which ones are worth it and which ones are not? Again, by your judgment. When is it worthwhile to identify yourself with your body? Okay, when you realize, okay, you're going to need this body to practice, you're going to need this body in order to live a healthy life. Okay, you look after it. It is your body because it is your responsibility. Other times you put the body aside. You focus more on your mental qualities. And there are times when you say, the body's not me. I've got to take care of the state of my mind instead. So again, this is a process we've been doing all the time, selfing and not selfing. And the Buddha is simply asking us to be more systematic about it so we can attain a really consistent and worthwhile goal. Now, one of the issues that comes up when I bring up this issue of how the Buddha never said there is no self, there's that phrase where the Buddha said to another, Sabbe Dhammanata, all phenomena are not self. And that's an important insight in the course of the practice. It's going to be one of the insights toward the end of the path. But some people say, well, doesn't that mean that all dhammas, all phenomena are not self? Doesn't that mean there is no self? But look at it in terms of how the Buddha teaches right view in other places as well. There's an interesting passage where Nandavindika has been, who was one of the Buddhist disciples, has been challenged by the members of another sect, saying, "What is this? What did your teacher teach? What is he? What views does he hold?" And Nandavindika, who was a stream eater at that point, who's already gained his first taste of awakening, says, "I really can't tell you what views the Buddha has. What about the monks? What are their views? Can't tell you their views either. Well, how about you? I'll tell you my views, but first you tell me yours." And so the wanderers go through the whole series of kind of the questionnaire of that time of the big issues. Is the cosmos eternal, non-eternal, finite, infinite? Is the self the same thing as the body? Is it something different? When an awakened person dies, does that person exist, not exist, both, or neither? And in each case, Nandavindika says, when you hold on to a view like that, you're holding on to stress. You haven't gained an escape from it. And so they ask him, well, what is your view? And he says, whatever has been brought into being is fabricated, will, dependently coerced, that is inconstant. Whatever is inconstant is stress. Whatever stress is not me, is not what I am, is not myself. And they said, well, in that case, you're clinging to that view too. And he says, no, through this view, I've seen the escape from it. Because after all, he says, whatever is fabricated and put together, the view itself is fabricated and put together. So the view itself ultimately will turn around and look at itself to see that it too is something that you should let go. So the view, it contains the seeds of its own transcendence. And it's the same with sabbe tamanata, all phenomena, not self. First you use that, you arrive at the end of the path, you have your first taste of the deffas. Most people will latch on to that, which is why they don't get full awakening right away. They just get stuck at the lower level of awakening. And so you have to realize, okay, even though this seems to be unfabricated, this too has to be let go of. This too is not self. But then the phrase sabbe tamanata, that too is a kind of dharma. It's actually fabricated. It too has to be let go. So the way that is phrased is not meant to lead to the conclusion that there is no self, because the Buddha again and again and again says, to say there is no self, to say there is a self, this is going to give you the wrong view. It's going to get you entangled. You use this particular insight first to let go of your attachments to other things, and then you turn it around on itself. You can't do that with the view that there is no self, but you can do it with this phrase, all phenomena are not self. What this means is that right view, when it's really right, contains a message for its own transcendence. It's like those notes that they give in the spy movies. After you've read this note, destroy it. And that way you let go of your final attachment. And this helps us understand what the Buddha has to say, and what's here also among the Thai forest Ajaans, which is that when you reach the really highest level of the practice, you have to let go not only of self and not self, you also have to let go of the idea of what's true. Okay, it may be true that all phenomena are not self, but you have to learn how to let go of that too. And so when the Buddha says, when you're fully awakened, you don't hold on to truths anymore. You've seen the truth. This is basically connects with the fact that in the Pali Canon, truth is defined in two ways. One, there's a fact, and then there's statements about facts. And so you're going to be letting go of all statements about facts. If the mind is going to gain awakening. But you do have the fact of nibbana, the ultimate happiness. So those are some of the points I wanted to make this morning, that the Buddha did not answer the question of whether there is or is not a self. The teaching on not self is meant to have you look instead at how you create your sense of self and realize it has its limitations, but within its limitations, there are certain ideas of self that are going to be useful in the path. Others that are going to be totally useless, you want to let go of them from the very beginning. And so you're going to be cultivating a skillful sense of self for part of the path, and also learning how to get more skillful in your perceptions of self and not self, until you reach the point where you don't need either. Now, to say that there is a self or is no self, or to define yourself as X, Y, or Z, finite or infinite, connected, interconnected, individual, permanent, not permanent, that's going to get in the way in this process of looking more directly at yourself as an action. So again, that's why the Buddha put that question aside. So those are my thoughts that I wanted to share with you this morning. We have time for Q&A.
All right, thank you. For the Q&A, if you want to ask a question, there's a couple of ways of doing it. Go to reactions, press on that, you'll see raise hand, and raise your hand. And after Ajaan answers your questions, then lower your hand. The important thing to point out here is this is being recorded and going on the web. And so you may want to protect your privacy. One thing is if, putting your full name down or any part of your name. If you want to change that, go to participants, click on that and go to the right and go to your name and click on your name and go to the right. You'll see 3 dots. Click on that and it'll say rename. So that's one thing. The other thing, if you don't want your face shown, put stop video, which is on your left. The second way, if you feel uncomfortable asking a question verbally, you can go to chat and put it in there, and we'll read your questions periodically. Balaji, can people ask questions on YouTube?
Yes, they can. And there is a 60-second delay in being able to see those questions, which is an automatic delay between YouTube and Zoom. Nothing can be done about that, but we can see those questions and I can relay them later on.
Okay, so it's 11:24 now. At 11:45, I'll start reading the questions from chat, and then you can read the questions from YouTube, and so let's see how that works out. Okay, the first question is from Alex. Remember to unmute when you asked your question, and then mute yourself afterwards.
Thank you, Ajaan. So my question is to do with the 4th tetrad of the Anapanasati. So you train yourself to breathe out, focusing on inconstancy. And how does the, so presumably that is a shorthand reference to the 3 perceptions. So how do you know when to apply that? What's the appropriate time to apply the perception of inconstancy, stress, and not self in regards to the 4th tetrad of the Anapanasati?
That's the topic for this afternoon. Can you wait?
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Robert?
Hello. So about a year ago, I feel like my meditation opened up quite a bit, and I was able to bring up like PT and Sukha at will, basically with my breath, and it lasted for maybe like 3 or 4 months, and then since then I seem to be unable to bring it up almost at all in any way like it was. And I guess now I kind of get to a place of stillness. But I kind of, but it seems like there's kind of a dullness there as well, because my mind will subtly start to wander, and then I'll kind of catch myself. But I was wondering if you just had any advice for either being able to get back in touch with the PT and Sukha, or potentially what to do from the still / potentially slightly dull state that I'm getting to now.
Okay, you became a bitchy junkie. And so what you got to do when something like that comes, you have to say, okay, how much is enough? How much do I actually need? And then learn how to figure out how do I go beyond this? So when you might want to back up and say, okay, I'll just sit here and I will let myself breathe for a while. And then finally the breath comes in. It's going to feel really good. Say, okay, that's the pleasure I was looking for. Where am I feeling it now? It might be that you have to now focus on different parts of the body than you did before. It's basically, it's kind of a reset. See how that works.
Thank you very much.
Christine?
Okay. Thank you, Ajaan, for the talk. You had said during your talk that the view contains the seeds of fabrication. What do you mean? I did not quite understand about the view.
No, the view itself is fabricated. It's something you put together. And so when the view says you've got to let go of all fabrications, okay, you let go of other fabrications first, and then you try and say, oh, this view is fabricated too. So I've got to let go of this. It contains the seeds of its own transcendence. That's what I said.
Oh, okay. Okay. Okay.
As I said, it's like those messages that say, after you've read this message, destroy the message.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're not just holding on to that insight.
Yeah. I'm trying to get to the point where I'm understanding my views behind the thoughts. Is that right? Should I be trying to understand my views behind the thoughts?
Yeah, ask yourself, well, where does this come from? What assumptions am I making? That's a useful question. Because when you bring the assumptions into the air, when you bring the assumptions up into the light of full day, you realize, okay, this isn't something I really want to follow.
Right, right. And sometimes I have a feeling with that, and so it's easy to find where it's coming from. But sometimes I don't, and so it's not so easy to read that. Okay, I have one more question. With the currents that come out of the mind, is a person able to understand the current as it comes out of the mind before knowing Nibbana, or do they have to wait for?
No, you can start observing that in your meditation. It's almost like there's this physical feeling, there's something going out, but you don't go with it.
Okay, I'm at the point where I can tell when the thoughts are blossoming, but that's it. Anyway, thank you.
Sarah?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm just trying to place some of these different views of identity in actual life, like on Facebook and things like that, when you find all these different views, and some of them sound actually really good. Like I do a lot of Qigong practice, which I find really helps with my meditation, but it's a lot about expanding into the universe, drawing the universal Qi down. And would that then be a theory of what you say here of identifying self with the universe?
Well,
and
actually,
how would you work with that?
You don't have to identify with it. You just say, look, I need to make this connection. After all, it's the Qi in the universe and the Qi in my body are basically the same kind of Qi. And so you don't have to identify, this is me, that I'm making identification with the universe, which is I'm connecting the energy channels in my body with everything that's out there. You can do that without defining yourself.
Which I think is what I do. Yeah, that really helps to clarify that. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Lee?
Thanks so much, Ajaan, Geoff. I have always been wondering why Buddha said, whatever is impermanent is not self. Why does self have to be permanent?
Okay, the question he doesn't say, but he's basically saying, is it worth claiming it to be yourself? It's a value judgment. And you can choose what you're going to identify with. Do you want to choose to identify with something that's impermanent? And for the sake of the path, there will be some temporary things that you're going to identify with, which is what we're going to discuss in the afternoon. But ultimately, when you've reached the end of the path, you don't need to identify with anything anymore. And so basically, at that point, it's not worth it.
Okay. I do have a second question. When going about daily life, I notice a lot of pain and suffering actually come from, our ego or me. This is me. They treat me this way or that way, and that's kind of like self, right? Identifying with myself. So I should just change the way I talk to myself. Oh, look, you're identifying yourself with this identity or that identity, and just let it go.
That's part of it. And also you can tell yourself, look, I don't have to make myself the target of their words. You're going to be choosing what you want to identify with, and the you as the victim of other people's mistreatment. That's not usually a good thing to identify with.
Yeah, that's a lot of things, not just other people treat me and how I behave. A lot of things driven by that self,
Yeah, well, again, try to see that there are many selves in there. It's not just one. And decide which one of the selves you want to identify with and which ones are actually causing you problems.
Just choose the one that's skillful.
Right.
Thanks again, Geoff.
Victoria?
Yes, thank you. I'm curious as to the ultimate purpose of trying to determine self or not self within the context of one's own perceptions, as opposed, in other philosophies, it's how the self functions in the larger context of humanity or of existence that's more important. So if someone dies, for example, in the legacy of that person or the obituary or whatever, it's a consideration from the people who were in contact with that person who died, what how that person was in life, if you know what I mean, how the function of that person. So in other words, to what degree I can see in like the previous question that was posed just now, how it's important not to allow others to determine our sense of self in a destructive way so that it doesn't serve us or anyone else for that matter. So it's unskillful. But by the same token, I wonder to what degree this inquiry is really important, or let's say maybe not important, but what are we actually ultimately determining here with this inquiry? Isn't it more how what purpose we're serving in the community or in the world or in this, or even in the context of a sangha, for example?
Okay, well, you think about the Buddha, his first priority was to gain awakening. And then he said, okay, now what can I do with this awakening? How can I be helpful? So for us, again, the first priority is how can we find freedom from suffering? And how you define yourself around that question, which selves are skillful, which ones are unskillful for that purpose. Then if part of that quest is going to be, the part of that practice is learning to be more generous. Again, you're practicing generosity for the sake of your ultimate freedom. Now, once you've attained ultimate freedom, then everything you do can be a gift to everybody else. And again, like the Buddha, he finally gained awakening. That's when he was able to help the most people. So the first step, the first priority though, is how do I identify myself? How do I learn to disidentify so that I can actually follow the path all the way to freedom? Once I've attained freedom, I'll be free to give everything I can. But it's also not the case that as you're on the path, you're not also helping people. But that's a secondary goal. You're helping people for the sake of training your mind.
It sounds like multitasking.
Well, it turns out it's not that bad.
I mean, it's great for the Buddha. I mean, and of course that's why we have this legacy 2,500 years later. I mean, I totally get that, but for those of us who are sort of stumbling along on this path, I don't know, there's something about that sounds, that the idea that it's a means to an end, that helping other people in the meantime until we're awakened sounds a bit, or it's countercultural in any event.
Yeah, of course it's countercultural. Look at our culture, it's crazy.
Okay, well, fair enough. All right, well, to be continued. Thank you.
Paseo?
Oh, actually, I didn't raise my hand, but I was thinking of a question.
I think it is a Hisu. Yeah, go ahead.
It was Hisu.
Hisu. Yeah.
Okay.
I didn't answer right.
Oh, were you calling me or not?
Hisu instead.
Jesus.
Oh,
Hisu is a hand up.
Okay, Hisu. There's no sound, Hisu.
You need to unmute yourself.
She's unmuted. I think it may be the problem with the volume on the computer.
Okay. Okay, no, we can't hear you, Hisu.
Why don't you type your question in? Who's next?
Jeremy?
Thank you, Ajaan, for being here. I was hoping I could validate a premise for my question first before the question itself. At any rate, is it correct that right view is the statement that all phenomena are not self? Is there more to it that I should be thinking of?
Right,
Okay.
right view is the Four Noble Truths.
Okay, and then how does that statement relate to the Four Noble Truths?
Okay, with the Four Noble Truths, each of the truth has a duty.
Okay.
The duty with regard to the first truth, there's just suffering, is to comprehend it. The duty with regard to the second is to abandon it. The duty with regard to the third is to realize it. And the duty with regard to the fourth is to develop it. So in order to comprehend suffering and to abandon its cause, the Buddha gives us a pattern of reflections. First, you want to watch this thing arise when it's arising, what's causing it.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, then you want to watch it passing away. Third, you want to look at the allure. What is it about these clinging aggregates that you really like?
Yes.
What is it about craving that you really like? And then fourth, you want to look at the drawbacks.
Yes.
And this is where the three perceptions come in.
I put the three characteristics first accidentally, didn't I?
Yeah.
Thank you. That was helpful. So thank you. So the statement you made around all phenomena are not self, containing the seed of its own transcendence. When I carry my concentration practice away from formal like sitting meditation or walking meditation, I can kind of perceive that amoeba as I go through daily life where I'm selfing and not selfing. And I can sense the practical utility, utility of that statement containing the seed of its own transcendence. So I find myself curious, what statement, if any, contains the seed of transcendence for getting away from statements of truth?
Okay, well, that one is one of them.
Okay, so you don't let that go. You just hold on to it until the end.
Yeah.
Okay.
Again, that's when you said all truths have to be transcended.
Okay.
Ultimately, you're going to have to turn around and look at this truth too.
That, I think, was the phrasing I was looking for. Thank you.
Yeah.
Valentine?
Tanajan, I have a question again regarding at the moment of death. What are skillful strategies that we can use from the perspective of self, not self? Like, for example, letting go of the body because thinking it's not self. That's my question.
Okay, well, you have to decide how far you feel ready to go on this. I mean, ideally, you should be able to drop your identification with everything. And there are people who gain awakening at the moment of death. However, your mind doesn't have the strength to say, okay, I want to hold on to the idea. If I have to come back, I want to come back to a place where I can practice.
Yeah.
So hold on to that.
Thank you.
So, hey, Sue, are you available now?
Yes, do you hear me now?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. So earlier you said that the teaching of not self is neither eternalism nor annihilationism. But in Udana 8.2, there was this sentence, for those who see and know, there is nothing. It sounds quite blunt, and it sounds like annihilationism. Could you please explain that?
I see. The nothing there is nothing worth clinging to.
Oh, so no object for papancha, is that what it means?
Or for a bunch of or clinging or craving or anything, yeah.
I see. So that sentence describes the state of nibbana, right?
Right.
And in nibbana, there is still the consciousness without surface.
Right.
Okay, thank you very much.
Zoom user? Someone a hand up says Zoom user. Let's go to Amy then.
Hello, Tana, John. Thank you very much for the talk. Yeah, I'm getting the message that questions of ontology are irrelevant for this journey. What confuses me about that, I can probably work with that. What confuses me is that there seem to be other questions of ontology in the scriptures in relation to other realms and beings such as devas. That's something that I've really struggled to square with.
Okay, well, the Buddha's not saying that all questions of ontology should be thrown out. I mean, after all, he does say that nibbana exists. That's a big ontology right there. But the question of what you are, that's defined by your defilements. And as long as you keep defining yourself by your defilements, you're going to be preventing yourself from getting awakening. So that's a particular ontology question that you put aside. Okay.
Thank you.
Gita?
Good evening, Bhante. Thank you for teaching us. We're ever so grateful, Thanissaro Bhikkhu. Bhante, if my understanding from your morning or this morning's talk is this correct? Hold on to a sense of self until we are ready to use it skillfully in order to reach Nibbana. And once you reach Nibbana or have crossed the path, then you can put aside the raft, and there is no self at that point in time because you've already reached the farther shore. So use skillful discernment.
You use your discernment. Again, think of yourself as not just one self, but there are many selves. And you have to figure out which of your selves are going to be useful for the path, which you have to let go of. So it's not like you just hold on to your idea of you, but you have to question, okay, what is worth holding on to in me? What is worth identifying? And then when you get to the other side, then you put all perceptions aside.
Right.
This is what, there's a passage where Ajaan Mahaprabhu was asked whether Nibbana was self or not self. And he says, Nibbana is Nibbana. Self and not self don't apply at that point at all.
So Bhante, are we using this self like to get rid of all the unwholesome states in our minds that arise, basically, right? Because and in the living present moment, as they arise, stay and pass away and see anatta in everything. And then once we reach that in a meditative state, skillfully, and reach the stages towards the enlightenment, right? And once we reach Nibbana Dhatu, the self completely, there is absolutely no self at that point.
There's, again, the Buddha wouldn't say there is no self. It's simply that you don't use the concept at that point.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That perception is gone.
Yeah. So conventional
but again,
truth and
as
ultimate
you're
truth.
getting there, you're going to be letting go more and more and more. you stop identifying with the aggregates.
Yes.
And that's the result of stream entry. But even after stream entry, there still is this sort of vague sense of I am that lasts through until arahatship.
Sakurdagami, Anagami, and Arahatship. Yes.
Once you hit arahatship, that's gone.
Yes.
So
Okay.
the question is, which of your many Gitas are?
Let go of all of them, Bhante. It's just a bunch of suffering.
Well, you've got to
It's
sort
not
through
worth
them.
it.
You can't just throw them out. You have to sort through them. Which ones are worth keeping and which ones are not.
Yes, absolutely. Hold on to the wholesome states until we fully develop them. Thank you, Bhante. May you live a long and healthy life and teach us lots of Dhamma. Thank you, Bhante.
Meryl?
Thank you. Hello. I have a question that's different. And what brought it up was when you were talking about view. And for me, it was holding to views and identifying with views. But this is somewhat different. This is about starting to lose your mind, which I have, and this might not be the proper time, and also tell me that. So that, part of I see as my identity is thinking, feeling. But when sometimes this happened, I would read something like multiple times and not remember anything in it. There was no clinging in the mind to what I was reading. And so there is that sense of self that's not there to be identified with, which is sort of okay. But it's sort of like it was hard sometimes to practice because you're forgetting a lot of what you know to practice. And that's sort of okay because I did notice moments of awareness, even though I wasn't quite aware of what I was aware of, if that makes any sense. But I knew that there was something. And that happened a lot. Yeah. So I guess when I'm thinking about self and non-self, I'm also thinking about, if we lose a function like mind or seeing, well, seeing is different because it's a sense, or the mind, which is what I know is a lot of my practice as well as the body. I'm not really articulating well, but I'm wondering, what do we do when we start going and losing our mind? How to continue to practice? Or what is self and what's not?
This is where you have to work on as much mindfulness as possible. We'll be talking, as I said, we'll be talking about the skillful use of self this afternoon. And so you want to keep on reminding yourself, okay, what are the important things I need to know? And just keep working at trying to remember that. What are the important things I need to know? I need to know what the state of my mind right now. I need to know, when my mind is going off into something unskillful, how to stop it.
Okay, but when the mind's not there.
Okay, then just say, okay, I'll wait until it comes back.
But what if sometimes it doesn't? Well, I don't know what happens on the other side of what I'm talking about. It's a totally different world. So I think there's a way of clinging to what I know versus what could be beyond that. Yes?
Okay, well, for the time being, I'd say hold on to what you know. Whatever good things you know, hold on to those.
Okay, and should I keep it simple? Like
keep it simple.
Excuse me, could you repeat that?
Keep it simple. Keep it simple. Give yourself some very simple instructions.
Okay, this is what I've been doing. Thank you.
Let me get to some of the questions here.
Okay.
And hopefully I get this right, because some people are not putting things in terms of questions.
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
In the Alagadupama Sutta, the Buddha speaks of the Ben who grieve over the loss of his atta as grieving about something which does not exist internally. Could this be interpreted that the self does not exist?
No, because again, when the Buddha said you take his teachings, there are two types of teachings. There are the teachings where you take the teaching just as for what it says and try not to work out the implications. And the second one is where you try to work out the implications. Now he says, if you try to work out the implications that there is no self, you're taking his teaching in a place where he wouldn't take it. Because he says again and again, do not work out that particular implication.
Okay, in Majjhima 25.
I've written more about this there's the essay or the short book called The Mirror of Insight, and I've written about this there. But the two types of teachings that the Buddha gave, whether we should draw out their implications or just leave them as they are.
The next question is, dear Ajaan, do we delight in the process of I making and my making, or do we delight in the world that we build around that? Or what do we cling to here?
You can delight in the I making, you can delight in the world. I mean, there's lots of things you can delight in. You've got to be careful about where you take your delight.
Another question. In Majjhima 25, Nivapa Sutta, views about the self being the body, etc. The undeclared questions are said to be Mara's doing, hurdles that he has fabricated to prevent meditators from escaping his grasp and influence. Are subtle I am conceits and fabrications of identification, anatta in the sense of the body, that they are one of Mara's tools or strategies to keep one bound to rebirth?
Okay, the question is, how are you going to use them? There are ways to use self in order to make yourself bound to rebirth, but you can also use your sense of self to motivate yourself to practice. This is why you have to be very careful about which sense of self you identify with. There is the self that would want to keep on coming back, and that's one sense of self. But you also have another sense of self that would like to be free, and that particular sense of self is useful. Remember what the Ananda taught to the nun about conceit. That eventually we're trying to get beyond conceit, but we use conceit to get there. And the conceit is, if other people can do this, they're human beings. I'm a human being. Why can't I do it too?
Do you see any other questions, Balaji?
Yeah. What was the purpose of the third noble truth he just gave?
The duty with regard to the third noble truth is to realize it.
Okay. Okay, so there is this question which is framed in this way. How is our experience, which more times than not eventually resorts back to being, seemingly bonded, tethered, bound to this body, rather than, say, a rock on Mars?
There's no way you can get inside the rock and inhabit it the way you can a human body.
Okay.
This is one on dependent co-arising.
Last one. Dear Ajaan, dependent co-arising, are these phenomena co-arising together, or they arise as in sequential steps? If they arise together, then when one removes one of the phenomena, all of them stop?
The problem is that it's both. It's both arising together at the same time, passing at the same time, and also arising over time. This is why it's so complex. Look at the book Shape of Suffering, and that has a very thorough discussion at that point.
Okay. Thank you very much.
So let's go back to the Zoom user. Are you available online now to ask a question?
Yes, thank you. I didn't realize that was me. Yeah, this might be a little off topic, but I've vacillated a lot on how where I stand and believe in rebirth. But there's a passage, I don't recall which sutta it's from, but it's talking about it's a funny analogy. The Buddha says, if there's a fire and you put out the fire, if you ask, oh, where did it go? To the west, east, that would be nonsensical. So yeah, I suppose my question is, what's if one, because you described how ultimately, like, you want to get to a place where you're not reliant on any sort of ontological certainty. It's more like just the causal certainty of, this, well, like, this is going to be skillful, this is going to be unskillful. So I guess I'm just wondering how I should approach, like, the uncertainty of rebirth, and like how it should relate to just being committed in practice.
Okay, well, it's good to take as a working hypothesis. You don't know for sure whether it's there or not, but ask yourself, if I actually took this on as a hypothesis for a while, how would I live my life? As opposed to how I would live my life if I didn't believe that my actions had long-term consequences. And you realize that you tend to be more responsible with your actions, and you have to be more careful about your actions. The image of the fire that you just mentioned refers to an arahat. I mean, that's someone who has no more fuel for being reborn. But as long as we still have craving and clinging, there's going to be fuel. So it is possible to talk about someone dying here and being reborn there. In fact, the Buddha uses a different image of fire for that. He says it's like a fire going from one house to another, and it clings to the wind as it goes. In the same way you cling to your craving as you go. So you can focus on, well, if the craving is going to be the problem, maybe I better work on my cravings right here and now. You understand how I'm not swept along by them. Next question.
Carolyn?
Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you, Bhante. My question is about spiritual bypassing. And so when you suggested that you choose the self, that that we have many selves, that is the most skillful, I was concerned that if some of the less skillful selves, well, I don't know if they're less skillful. Let's say we go back to Western psychology and look at family systems and consider there's these frozen parts of ourselves that were frozen by trauma at age 7 or 8 or 9 or 2. And if we don't address those selves, they will keep coming up and being traumatized by everyday living. And so my question is around, well, if we ignore those selves, then because they're not skillful, they have these belief systems, then we're not really taking care of them in a way that would be liberating.
Okay, this in this case, you have to look at, well, what would be a skillful approach to those selves? A skillful approach would be to create a space in your mind where you feel secure enough so that you can sort of bring these selves up and say, okay, what's the issue? Let's talk. But first you have to create that space inside. And then when we say that you sort of let go of the selves, some cases you can't just say, well, goodbye, we're gone. You have to say, okay, let's talk things over first before you go. And sometimes, these selves that are traumatized, whatever, they may have something to offer. And so you're willing to listen.
Right, exactly. That's where you learn, right? That edge. Great, thank you.
So last question for the morning, Maria.
Ajaan, my question is related to applying no self-teaching to my daily life. And I'd like you to validate if I'm understanding it correctly and if my thinking is comprehensive. So the way that I think about it in applying the not self-teaching of the Buddha to my daily life is along the idea of don't take things personally. So that's 1. 2, don't believe everything I think. And then 3, let go of what I'm attached to, whether that's my expectation, my thoughts of others, or my ideas of what I'm identifying with. Is that correct? And is it comprehensive?
Okay, well, it's not quite comprehensive because there are some things you got to hold on to in the meantime. Yeah, and you decide, okay, this particular issue that I'm holding on to right now, is this going to be helpful? Is it not going to be helpful? And be selective in how you let go of things. Let's put it that way. Don't just don't just drop all your expectations. So, you have some expectations for the path, and the Buddha had expectations on his path, right? He said, "I'm going to find the end of suffering," and he held to that. So you hold on to the good things, and that's largely a question of discernment, learning how to let go of the unskillful ones. Like we said just now, sometimes you can just say, "Well, goodbye." Other times you have to say, "No, we have to talk things over first before we part ways."
So I guess I wasn't, so I hear what you're saying. And so the way that I apply this is, if I'm creating misery for myself or others, that's when I start questioning, oh, should I believe what I'm thinking? Is this right?
Right.
Yeah. So I'm not letting go of all my, yeah. So I think I'm doing what you're saying.
Okay.
And I think what you're saying, so have I missed anything other than what we've talked about?
Well, we're going to be talking about this particular topic more this afternoon, so tune in.
Okay. Thank you.
And then we check in at the end of the talk. Okay, well, we'll come back 2 o'clock my time.
Yeah.
Another 2 hours from now.
Yeah, 2 o'clock Pacific time. So see you all then.
Okay, be well in the meantime.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ajaan.
Welcome back, Ajaan Geoff.
Is he on?
I got some notes from people said they had registered but never got links.
Yeah, but Valentine said that also. Let's speak to Rob about that and ask what's
up.
On.
Maybe we can just send the link from our Parisā, Steve, if people are not getting it. So if Sati Center has not sent the links, maybe we can just send them.
Yeah, but we don't know who to send them to. I mean, Rob has that.
Right. Okay.
Also, I want to apologize, Balaji. I forgot to introduce you this morning.
No, you should introduce. Ajaan is the.
No, but I said this meeting is hosted. I said my name is Steve. Your name and my co-host Balaji. I forgot all about that. It's the first year I've done that.
That's okay.
Is Sati Center on? Because I saw this morning they were on, or IMC. They may be able. If they're on, we can ping them. Anybody from Sati Center on or IMC?
I'm just looking at the Zoom people. I don't see them.
Yeah, this morning. I'll send Rob an email.
Okay.
But your Valentine said that out this morning, and I sent him the link.
Yeah, thank you. I registered for the one in September, and you mentioned that we're gonna receive, even if you registered a while ago, but I didn't receive anything. So thank you for sending email personally.
It's possible I wouldn't have gotten it either, but I actually re-registered, and then they sent me an email afterwards saying that if you're registered, they'll send it out. So one of the quirks Rob has to work out.
Okay. So, Ajaan, it's about just 1 minute. We can start whenever you're ready. I'll turn on the recording this time to make sure that everything. But by the way, even if we lost a little bit in the beginning, I can retrieve whatever we didn't record.
It's just part of the guided meditation.
Yeah, but even if we didn't record in Zoom, it's streamed on YouTube, so I can retrieve it from YouTube, and I can send it at least to you and to Steve and Rob.
I went back and I checked that passage. You know, there was that question about the Judgment 22 and what doesn't exist inside. And it turns out the passage is talking about a cosmic self. And that's the one self view that the Buddha really ridicules as being possible. So it's not a general statement about you have no self inside, but specifically that if you believe that you have a cosmic self, you're believing in something that's impossible.
Balji, you'll MC the questions this afternoon?
I can, sure.
I did morning, do the afternoon.
Okay. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Ajaan. Please feel free to start speaking whenever you're ready. I'm going to mute all participants right now, but Ajaan, maybe you're going to have to unmute yourself again.
Okay, fine. Okay, I recommend that you get back into meditation. And since I'm going to assume that you've been meditating during the break, I'll just start right in with the talk. I talked this morning about how on the path you need to use the perception of self and the perception of not self selectively. After all, you're engaged in the process of becoming already. And that process involves creating a sense of self around a desire. And also having a sense of the world in which that desire can be attained. So as you're practicing, part of the path is that you generate the desire to abandon unskillful qualities and to develop skillful qualities. And so you're creating a temporary becoming as part of the path, and there will be a sense of self involved in it that's let go totally only at arahantship. Several passages in the canon indicate that even non-returners have a lingering sense of I am around the 5 khandhas. They don't explain it much, but it seems to indicate the fact that you still have a sense that you can exert some control over the aggregates. So you might as well learn how to use that sense of I am to put it to good use as part of the path. In other words, you have to train your senses of self to be good before you give them up. You get used to them, and then you let them go, not out of aversion, not out of a sense of appreciation for what they've done, but realizing that you have reached the point now where you can go beyond it. I've often found that people who talk about how horrible the ego is or how bad self is tend not to develop a sense of self properly in the course of the path. And as a result, their letting go tends to be a little bit more neurotic. So you have to learn how to, as I said earlier this morning, learn how to delight in a sense of agency. This is something you can do. You can see yourself improving as you develop more and more skills along the path. And that's a healthy sense of self to develop. When the Buddha talks about using the sense of self in a skillful way, he gives it basically 3 roles. There's the self as producer. In other words, you have that desire. You have the sense of you as the person who will be able to attain that desire. There's the self as the consumer, the person who will benefit from attaining that desire, who will enjoy that attainment. And finally, the self is commentator, who watches over the other two selves and makes suggestions for how they might do things better to get a better form of happiness. And all of these play a role already in the state of becoming. For example, you have a desire for some ice cream. Okay, there's a sense of you who will have the resources to either buy the ice cream or has the skill to make the ice cream. That's the self as producer, or the self as agent. Then there's the self as consumer, the person who will actually enjoy the taste of the ice cream when you get it. And then finally, there's the self as commentator, talking about, well, do you really need that ice cream? Or what kind of ice cream would be best for you? Makes suggestions about how things are going with the other two roles of self. And we create these senses of self around everything that we do. And here the Buddha is saying, well, you do the same thing with the path. In terms of the self as the producer, he talks about the self in terms of conceit. There's a passage where a nun is talking to a nun, and he's telling her basically that even though we try to overcome conceit, the conceit that I am, that's part of the path, as part of the goal. As part of the path, you need to cultivate that sense of I am, in the sense that see that other people can do this. They're human beings, I'm a human being. They can do it, why can't I? So you try to develop a sense of competence. This is why the Buddha talks about developing the self as a mainstay, or the self as a refuge. That you can depend on yourself in order to be able to attain this. And you have it within you that you can do this. This is definitely a sense of self that you need on the path. Then there's the self as the consumer, the one who's going to enjoy this. There's a passage where the Buddha talks about a monk who's getting discouraged in the path and is thinking of giving up. And so he talks about different ways in which you can motivate yourself to stick with it. He calls it, there's the self as there's the self as a governing principle, there's the world as a governing principle, and there's the Dharma as a governing principle. The world as a governing principle, it's an interesting one. It says there are people out there in the world who can read minds. If they see my mind as I'm thinking of giving up, what are they going to think? Partly you think about the compassion they would have for you. And then secondly, you would feel the feeling of embarrassment that your thoughts are being known by others. The Dharma as a governing principle is realizing, well, you found an excellent Dharma, it'd be a shame then if you abandoned it. The self as a governing principle is basically the realization, I came to this path, I entered on this path because I wanted to put an end to suffering. If I give up on it, does that mean I don't want to put an end to suffering? The Buddha is basically asking you, do you love yourself? If you really love yourself, then you can stick with the path. And the sense of self-love is actually useful then as part of the practice. There's also what they call renunciate grief, when you realize there are others who have attained this wonderful goal, total freedom from suffering. I'm not there yet. That's the consumer who's feeling deprived, who would like to have some more of this. It's meant to act as an impetus to the producer as well to get going on this path, so that you can actually attain yourself. The self as commentator, I mentioned that earlier this morning, the Buddha's teachings to Rahula. I would like to go back to them again. This is when Rahula was 7 years old. And after the Buddha gave some lessons on being truthful, he says you should look into your actions as you would look into a mirror. And before you do something, ask yourself, what is my intention here? Do I anticipate that this action that I intend to do will cause harm to myself or to others or to both? If I do, I should stop. I should not act on that intention. If you don't see anything wrong with the intention, go ahead and act. While you're acting, you look at the results of the action. So this action that I am doing, is it leading to harm for myself, for others, or for both? If you see some harm coming up immediately while you're doing the action, then you stop. If you don't see any harm, you can continue. Finally, when you're done, you look back on the long-term results. And then you realize, again, you ask, this action that I did. Notice all these times you're taking responsibility for the action. This action I intend to do, this action I am doing, this action that I did or that I have done. Did it lead to harm for myself, others, or both? If it did, You go and talk it over with someone else who is more advanced in the path to get some idea on how not to repeat that mistake. And then you determine not to repeat that mistake. If you don't see any harm, then you take joy in the fact that you're getting better on the path. And you use that joy, that sense of self-esteem to motivate yourself to continue on the path. So the self as commentator here is being trained in the proper values it should have. And most people complain about the internal judge, the internal critic. And you see a lot about not listening to the internal critic or silencing the internal critic. Actually, the Buddha doesn't say to silence the critic. He says basically, learn how to train it. So it's actually useful. Have it focus on your intentions, focus on your actions, focus on the results of your actions. And take a mature attitude toward mistakes. The Buddha is basically saying, try not to make a mistake, but if you do make a mistake, this is what you do. Years back, I was giving a retreat in Santa Fe. And there was a therapist on the retreat who was leading a mindfulness-based therapy group. And she took the copy of the sutta that I just told you about and gave it to the people in the group as a part of their last meeting. And then she asked, what do you think of the Buddha as a parent? And all the people in the group said, if we had parents like this, we wouldn't need this therapy group. He's basically teaching them a mature attitude to have toward the internal critic, training the internal critic so it actually is helpful on the path. That's a sense of self that you really need. So these are the roles that the Buddha gives. And what are the values that the Buddha teaches to the commentator? Well, one is that you are observant and honest. In fact, those are the first two requisites that the Buddha said he wanted in any student. He said, let a person come who is observant and no deceiver, and I will teach that person the Dharma. Because when you want a student who is honest with you about what he or she is doing, and you also want this person to be honest with him or herself about what he is doing or she is doing. So that you can actually see what you're doing, where you're making a mistake, and then learn how to correct it. But you're also being taught to be heedful, realizing that your actions will make a difference, so you have to be careful about how you act. Compassionate, you don't want to harm anybody. You have a healthy sense of shame. In other words, the shame that is the opposite of shamelessness. We're not talking about the shame that's the opposite of pride. The Buddha is actually teaching you to have a sense of pride around your actions, that you are capable of doing the good things. But you realize simply that certain actions are beneath you. That's the kind of shame he's trying to have you develop. And most importantly of all is a willingness to learn. If you come here with the attitude, okay, I'm the sort of person who just cannot make mistakes, okay, you're going to be hiding all your mistakes from yourself, which is not healthy. But if you realize, okay, I'm here where I can learn, I'm willing to learn, and you make that part of your self-image, okay, that's going to actually help you on the path. Now the Buddha has, as you apply these selves to the activities that are useful for making merit and for the practice of concentration. In terms of merit, you talk to yourself about what a better person you become as you become generous, as you practice the precepts, as you develop thoughts of goodwill. And you're not just talking to yourself to give yourself self-esteem, but you're actually doing things that are conducive to self-esteem. When you are generous, when you are virtuous, when you can cultivate thoughts of goodwill, even for people you don't like. There's a strong sense of your own nobility, your own honesty, your own integrity that comes with that. And as you develop a healthy sense of self in these ways, it's a lot easier to start approaching the difficulties of training the mind in concentration and discernment. Years back when Ajaan was teaching at IMS, I think it was the second or third day of the retreat, he turned to me and he said, have you noticed how everyone here is so grim about the meditation? There's a notice that YouTube is not working. And he attributed the fact that they were so grim in their meditation because they didn't have a background in the Buddhist teachings on generosity and virtue. Because a lot of the teachings about generosity and virtue, that you're going to be happy by giving things away, you're going to be happy by refraining from doing things. And when you're small, you're very counterintuitive. But as you practice them, it develops a sense of self-worth and also a sense of trust in the teachings, a sense of your own capability to do the practice, which will serve you in good stead when you start meeting up with your defilements directly. In the practice of concentration. And as I said, concentration as part of the path is part of a state of becoming. The Buddha describes it in terms of the 5 aggregates. There's form, feeling, perceptions, thought fabrications, and consciousness, all there in the concentration you're trying to develop. Form in the sense of the body, the breath that you're focusing on. Feelings, the feelings of pleasure that you're trying to develop. Perceptions and the images you hold about how the breath moves through the body, how you can adjust the breath. When it comes in, how does it come in? When it goes out, how does it go out? You can play with various perceptions here. You can perceive the breath as originating from outside, or you can perceive it as originating inside the body. If it originates inside the body, and here we're talking about the breath as one of the aspects of the wind element in the body, the in and out breath. Where does it originate? And you can focus on different parts of the body and see which area the breath energy begins to originate as you breathe in, each time you breathe in. And then there's the question, does it really originate in any one spot, or does it originate all over the body? You can hold in mind the perception of all the cells in the body breathing in, breathing out in unison. And that can really get you into strong states of concentration. As for thought fabrications, there's directed thought and evaluation as you're adjusting the breath, adjusting the mind, so that the two of them fit together well. And then there's consciousness, which is your awareness of all these things. And you are creating a state of becoming as you do this. You, the meditator who's watching over things, who's able to master the skills of meditation. There'll be the part of you that's enjoying the pleasure or enjoying the equanimity as they come. And then there'll be the commentator. The commentator especially is there in the direct thought and evaluation, working on getting the concentration to be really good. So it's in these ways that the Buddha talks about self, a healthy sense of self, as being an important part of the practice. Even with discernment, you are motivated by your desire to understand the problem of suffering, to see how you're creating the cause, how you can put an end to it. So you use your sense of self in a wise way, this way. And as I said, this is the best way to learn how to get beyond your sense of self, is to train yourself to be skillful and see how far a skillful sense of self can go. You'll finally reach a point, of course, where it can only go so far and you have to go beyond it. But when you go beyond it, you're going on beyond it, not out of a sense of hatred or aversion, but simply out of a sense of, okay, this has taken me as far as I can go. I need something better. I need a better strategy. Because remember, we talk about the sense of self as a strategy for happiness. The point I didn't make this morning is many people don't like to hear the teaching on that self because they feel that the Buddha is trying to deprive them of their strategies for happiness. But it's better to see that he's actually telling you these are better ways of finding happiness, and not self will be an important part of that strategy. We'll get to this later. It's also useful to look at the Buddhist teachings in terms of what modern psychology identifies as healthy ego functions. You see that these two are areas where the Buddha would emphasize that it is important to develop a sense of self. According to modern psychology, your ego is the part of your mind that negotiates between the various needs in the body for the sake of your happiness. The needs of the body, the needs of your social needs, and then learning how to deal with other people. Freud would analyze these things in terms of the id, the ego, and the superego. The superego is basically what society tells you you should do. Your id is your raw desires. And then your ego is negotiating between the two. From the Buddhist point of view, the shoulds there are replaced by the harsh shoulds in Freud's world with the shoulds of the Four Noble Truths. In other words, you should try to comprehend suffering. You should try to abandon its cause. You should try to realize its cessation, and you should try to develop the path to its cessation. These are shoulds that are entirely aimed at your happiness. So from the Buddhist point of view, you don't have quite the sense of inevitable and unending conflict that you have in Freud's view of the mind. But there are parts of the mind that do have to negotiate between the various desires that you have, because after all, you do have skillful desires and unskillful desires. And you have to learn how to negotiate. Modern psychology identifies 5 healthy ego functions. And I'll just give you the list first, and we'll go down them in detail. There's anticipation, altruism, suppression, sublimation, and humor. Anticipation is when you foresee certain dangers that you have to prepare for. This requires a sense of self. Altruism, realizing that your happiness cannot depend on the suffering of others. If it does depend on the suffering of others, they're going to put an end to it. So if you really want to be happy, you have to take their well-being into consideration. Suppression is when you realize there are things that you want to do, but if you do them, it's going to be harmful to you in the long run. So you learn how to say no. And then sublimation is when you try to find an alternative happiness for the mind. So you don't feel starved by the process of suppression. And then finally, humor is sort of lightness that you can bring to this process. The ability to distance yourself from yourself. This is training your commentator to step back with it, having a good-natured attitude towards your foibles. And learning how to laugh at your foibles is often an important part of learning how to go beyond them. Now, the Buddha teaches all of these functions as part of the path. Sometimes you hear that Buddhism teaches egolessness. And I know therapists who roll their eyes when they hear that, because they think that you're teaching people to deprive themselves of important functions of the mind. But the Buddha never talks about the ego as being a bad thing. And he certainly does encourage these 5 processes. In fact, he adds a 6th one, which is another healthy ego function we'll get to in a minute. But first, you've got the anticipation. For Buddhism, of course, the word here is heedfulness. You see that there are dangers that lurk in the future that depend on whether you're going to act skillfully or not. If you act skillfully, you can avoid those dangers. Sometimes we hear heedfulness, and the emphasis seems to be on the dangers there. But it's also important to realize that when the Buddha is saying these dangers can be avoided if you're careful, he's pointing to the power of your actions to make a difference in your life. And because you have that power, take advantage of it. Be careful in what you do and say and think about the long term. Remember that the training and discernment, he says, begins with asking that question: what when I do will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness? What when I do will lead to my long-term harm and suffering? That's training in heedfulness, essentially. And that underlies all the strengths that you're going to have to develop on the path. As for altruism, the Buddhist teaching, of course, is on compassion. You have to have compassion for others. Again, because if your suffering depends on their harm, they're not going to stand for it. There's a famous story in the canon. King Vasanadi is in his palace, in his private apartments, one-on-one with Queen Malika, his favorite queen. And in a tender moment, he turns to her and he says, "Malika, is there anyone that you love more than yourself?" You can think about what he's anticipating. A typical man. He wants her to say, "Yes, Your Majesty, I love you more than I love myself." And if this were Hollywood, yeah, that's what she would say. But this is the Pali Canon, and Malika is no fool. She says, "No, there's nobody I love more than myself. And how about you? Is anybody you love more than yourself?" And the king has to admit that, well, there's nobody he loves more than himself. So that's the end of that scene. The king goes down from the palace, goes to see the Buddha, and reports to him what Malika said. And the Buddha says, she's right. You could go all over the world and you would never find anybody that you love more than yourself. By the same token, though, everybody else loves themselves just as fiercely as you love yourself. And so the message that the Buddha, or the lesson that the Buddha derives from that, is not that this is a dog-eat-dog world. He says, as a result of that, you should never harm anyone or cause anyone to do harm. In other words, you have to respect that person's desire for happiness. You can read this in 2 ways. One is the more pragmatic issue of, if you harm them in your search for happiness, they're not going to be happy with your happiness. They're going to try to put an end to it. But then 2, you begin to sympathize with others. You realize we're all in the same boat. We all want happiness. And it's only fair then that you should make sure that your happiness doesn't harm anybody else. So here you can see compassion, even though we tend to think of it as probably the most selfless of all the virtues, does come down to an intelligent sense of self, a wise sense of self. As for suppression, the Buddhist term here is restraint. You realize that both in terms of the things that you do and in terms of the things that you take in through your senses, you have to be very careful about what you do. Learning how to say no when you know that it's going to cause harm. And as I said, restraint here applies not only to the things you do and say and think, but also how you engage with your senses. Because as the Buddha said, we're not passive in our engagement of the senses, we're more active. Oftentimes we're looking for trouble. Well, this is why we have the internet. The internet doesn't turn itself on and poke itself in our eyes. We're the ones who turn it on because we're looking for something. And the question is, what are we looking for? And who's doing the looking? Is it your greed doing the looking, lust doing the looking, anger doing the looking? As Ajaan would like to point out, he said, it's not the case that we're just sitting around doing nothing and all of a sudden something comes in and creates greed, aversion, and delusion in our minds. So there are times when we look for something to be angry about. So we turn on, well, he doesn't say hate radio, but we're looking for something and then we're looking for something to aggravate the anger. We're feeling lust, we're looking for something to excite the lust. So you have to show some restraint there, because otherwise you clutter up your mind, especially if you're trying to meditate. You're cluttering up your mind all day with these activities. So they're going to continue as you sit down and close your eyes. So as an important part of the meditation, you realize, okay, I have to be very careful about how I engage with my senses. I have to be very careful about how I use my words, my thoughts, my deeds. And I have to know how to say no in an effective way. A part of saying no in an effective way is the process of sublimation. In other words, find an alternative pleasure. And here the Buddha talks about the pleasures of being generous, the pleasures of being virtuous, and above all, the pleasures of concentration. If you learn how to develop these forms of pleasure, and then you have an alternative, so it makes it easier to say no to your greed, aversion, and delusion. This is why the Buddha gives an analogy. He says it's like restraint of the senses is like having 6 animals, and they're tied to leashes. You have a dog, you have a hyena, you have a crocodile, a bird, snake, monkey. You tie the leashes, and then you tie the leashes together, and what's going to happen? Well, the animals are going to push and pull each other until finally one of them, who's ever the strongest, will drag all the others off. In this case, it's probably the crocodile, drag all the other animals down into the river, and they're going to drown. He says, what you need is a post. In this case, the post is mindfulness of the body. You tie all the leashes to the post, and the animals can pull and pull and pull. They're not going to go anywhere very far. And the reason that post is so solid is because mindfulness of the body leads to concentration, which leads to a strong sense of well-being inside. And you can use that well-being to feed the mind, feed your hungers. So you're not hungering for things outside. And this would be sublimation, which again is a healthy ego function. You realize that you have desires for happiness, and you can't just deny them. The Buddha tried that for 6 years and realized it was going to lead to his death. When he found the middle way, he realized, okay, there are certain pleasures that you can develop, which will compensate for the pleasures that you're giving up as you try to develop the path. And finally, with a sense of humor. The Buddha doesn't talk about humor that much, but there's plenty of it in the canon. You see it sometimes in stories, in the suttas. And the virtue of humor, as I said, is the ability to step back from your defilements and be able to laugh at them. And that's one of the most effective ways of dealing with greed, aversion, and delusion. Pull yourself out of the stories they tell you, pull yourself out of the worlds that they create. And you create some distance. And there's that famous story about the nun who was going through a forest one time. And goldsmith's son comes up and he tries to seduce her. Now she's a non-returner, so she's not the least bit interested. And all she can do is basically laugh at the guy. And she said, what do you see in this body of mine? It's just full of all kinds of disgusting things. And he says, your eyes are just so beautiful. I can't get over your eyes. And she says, well, the eyes is just like little bubbles full of mucus and all that kind of stuff. And she says, but if you really like my eyes, here, have one. And she plucks out her eye and hand it to him. Well, that's the end of that scene. He says, I'm sorry, I didn't playing with you is like playing with fire. And so she has a good laugh. And she goes to see the Buddha, and then the Buddha, as she sees the Buddha, her eye is restored. Just as an aside, that particular sutta, I've seen it translated in ways in which the guy comes off as being pretty crude, and no woman in her right mind would ever go with this guy. The actual sutta in itself, he's probably one of the most articulate people in the Pali Canon. And his inducements for her to go with him are some of the prettiest passages in the Pali Canon of all. So it shows, okay, even with those inducements, the person who's really beyond lust doesn't feel any inclination. It's also interesting to note how he tries to seduce her. He doesn't talk about sex directly. He talks about it very indirectly, but he talks about basically, you come and live with me and you will be like a golden doll and you will live in this beautiful world. And it's all about trying to create a state of becoming in her mind where she would be willing to go with him. And she's not susceptible to that, but it's interesting that this is how a lot of seduction takes place. It's appealing to that person you're trying to seduce, appealing to that person's sense of becoming, what that person would like to become, the world in which that person would like to live. This is just an aside to point out how sensuality works, and how if you can develop a sense of humor around it, as I said, the passages are some of the prettiest passages in the canon, but they're treated humorously, as saying, okay, even though these are really pretty passages and they're really seductive, it's still pretty miserable what this guy is trying to do for this woman. That's one example of humor. Other examples of humor in the Pali Canon tend to be found in the Vinaya, which is the section of rules for the monks and the nuns. And I think it's instructive that this is where you find so much of the humor, in the sense that they have origin stories for each of the rules. And many of the origin stories are very funny. And the purpose of this is to get you on the side of the person making the rule. If you're being subjected to a code of rules written by someone who has no sense of humor at all, you're going to chafe, you're going to rebel. But if you see the rules as an outcome of someone's wise humor about the human condition, it's a lot easier to side with the rules against that particular defilement. I'll give you an example. There was a monk who had a lot of psychic powers, but he was not very articulate. And the time would come every now and then when he would have to instruct the nuns. And he would repeat the same old stanza over and over and over again, and then that would be the instruction. Well, it comes to be his time. Word gets to the nuns, it's just this monk's turn to instruct the nuns, and the nuns say, oh my gosh, him again. This is not going to be very effective. Just going to repeat that same stanza over and over and over again. So they go. And so he goes through the formalities, and then he says, okay, here's today's instruction. And he starts repeating the stanza. And the nuns turn to one another and they say, see, didn't we tell you this is not going to be effective at all? Well, he overhears them. And so he levitates up off the ground, splits his body into many forms, some of them emitting light, some of them emitting smoke, some of them emitting fire, water. And each of them is repeating many different stanzas of the Buddha, that one plus many others. And the nuns say, wow, this is the most effective Dharma talk we've ever seen. Well, he gets carried away and continues displaying his powers until after dark. And so the time comes for the nuns to leave. They go back to the city where the nunnery is, and it turned out the city gates are closed. So they have to spend the night outside. And then the next morning when the city gates are open, they come into the city, and the people say, oh, here come the nuns after spending the night with the monks. And so this is the reason why we have a rule against the monks teaching nuns during the nighttime. But it's also a lesson in, if you have psychic powers, watch out, don't get carried away. So those are some of the uses of humor. Finally, there's a sense of shame. As I said, this is the shame which is the opposite of shamelessness. You want to look good in the eyes of the noble ones, as in that passage I talked about just now, where they talk about the world as a governing principle. You think about how the noble ones would regard you if you start doing something really unskillful. On the one hand, they'd be disappointed. On the other hand, they would be compassionate for your well-being. They would be disappointed in you more than anything else. And you use that sense of shame to spur yourself not to do unskillful things. So these are some healthy ego functions that the Buddha recommends. He doesn't call them ego functions, but they are lessons that correspond to what modern psychology would regard as an ego function. This is another way in which you use your sense of self. Anticipation basically trains your commentator. You think about the long term if you're going to comment on your actions. Altruism, again, trains your commentator. You've got to think about the well-being of other people. Suppression trains your commentator. Sublimation trains all three aspects of the self. In other words, you say, okay, if I go for that other unskillful activity, it's going to cause harm. What can I do that would be more skillful? And then the producer is able to produce something that is more skillful, and the consumer learns how to enjoy that. And again, humor trains all three of them. Your senses of self, the producer, the consumer, and the commentator. Commentator, as you step back, the consumer is willing to step back from his or her or its desires and realize, okay, there's just something wrong there. And then the producer is able to provide something better. So those are some of the functions of skillful use of self on the path. As for not self, as you're engaged in the practices of the path, there are certain things you're going to have to give up as part of this activity of restraint. There are certain attachments you're going to have to let go of. And this is where you bring out the concept of not self. In other words, you learn to see these things as not being yours. For example, in the practice of generosity, if you're really attached to the things you have, it's going to be very difficult to be generous. But if you learn to reflect on them and realize, okay, these things that I have here, what is their real value? I get more value out of them if I learn how to give them away and develop the perfection of generosity. These things are not mine permanently. I'm going to have to lose them at some point anyhow. So why don't I lose them in such a way that I actually benefit from them and I'm not just deprived by them? So you learn how to see the things as not yours, really. They're simply there. You have the ability to use them, but they're not really yours. That makes it a lot easier to give them away. Because as I said earlier, when you're developing a healthy sense of self, there's going to be a sense of not self that goes along with it. Wherever there is a sense of self, there will be not self. Basically, a sense of self defines a boundary. Whatever sits outside of the boundary is not self. You learn how to move that boundary around so that it actually makes it easier for you to follow the path. There's a passage also in terms of virtue where the Buddha talks about three things that would deter you from following the precepts. Concern about your wealth, concern about your health, concern about your relatives. In other words, there are ways that you can engage in trade where if you lie, you get a better price. But you have to be willing to forego that better price in order to stick by your precepts. Years back, I had a student whose mother was going to give a large sum of money to a Buddhist center. And he called me up and said, basically, what can I tell her so she would give the money to the monastery? And for monks, we're not allowed to tell people where to give their gifts. The rule is if someone comes and says, where should I give this gift? We're supposed to say, give it where you feel inspired or where you feel that it would be well used, well taken care of. And so instead of giving suggestions on how we can get the money for the monastery, I told him, okay, tell your mother, give her gift where she feels inspired. So she gave it someplace else. And so I realized, okay, I now have a precept that's worth more than that amount of money. So there are times when observing the precepts will involve losing the opportunity for wealth, especially when you have to be truthful. In terms of your health, say that the economy collapses, a crazy government gets involved in 3 or 4 wars all at once, and the only way you're going to get any food is if you steal it. And you have to say, no, even in a case like that, I'm not going to steal. So even though your health may suffer from that, you're much better off by holding to your precepts. In terms of your relatives, the same sort of thing. My family are going to starve unless I can steal. Just think you teach them, no, I'm not going to steal. We don't live by stealing. Okay, you're drawing your sense of not self on around your wealth and your health and your relatives, which, as the Buddha says, that kind of loss, if you lose your wealth, health, and relatives, that's minor compared to losing your virtue, losing your right view. And that's going to require a certain rearranging of your idea of what is yours and what is not yours. So what's worth laying claim to and what's not worth laying claim to. But it's an important part of practicing. And then in general, you'll find other things that will come up, especially when you're developing concentration, all the distractions that come up into the mind, things that would pull you away from your topic. You have to regard those as not self as well. This is where the Buddha begins to recommend a 5-step program. Some of you probably know this already, for learning how to develop dispassion for things. In other words, to see that they're not worth claiming as self. As I said earlier, I've been trying to make the point all throughout the day that your sense of self is basically a value judgment. And so how do you train yourself to see that your defilements are not worth holding on to? And the defilements here would include, like we mentioned this morning, that the traumatized child from way back and other psychological issues you have. And the Buddha's way of dealing with this with the one, try to give the mind a safe place to be in. This is what you try to develop with the concentration. And then try to notice when a particular defilement comes up, how it is originated, what comes along with it, what causes it. You're not just looking at it arise, but you're also looking at its arising in connection with something else. And then you notice that it passes away. And then it comes back. It's not like these defilements last all the time. They come and they go, they come and they go. And once they come and they go away, then you dig them up again. Now, sometimes you dig them up, say there's a problem with anger. Okay, the hormones are still going through your system. And you read that as a sign, well, I must still be angry. And so the part of the mind that enjoys the anger will pick it up again. So this is why when you start picking these things up and running with them, you have to ask yourself, what's the allure? What part of me likes that? This is where it's useful to see the mind as a committee. Some of the members of the committee like that particular development, other members don't. You've got to figure out, well, the ones who do like it, what do they like about it? What's the allure? And this is something that's going to take a lot of digging around, because often there's a part of the mind that doesn't like to admit to itself why it likes to go with these things. But if you can see the mind as a committee, it makes it a lot easier to disidentify with certain members of the committee and to identify with the more skillful ones. Once you see the allure, then you compare it with the drawbacks. And when you can see, okay, running with this particular defilement is going to lead to these problems, and you see it's not worth it. When you see it's really not worth it, then you develop dispassion for it, and that's the escape. Again, value judgment. This is really not worth going with. Now, this works most effectively, as I said, when you really see what the allure is, and the mind is going to lie to itself about what the allure is. You have to dig around. And so you do this in conjunction with your concentration practice so that you have a sense of a solid center, a safe place inside. And you've also strengthened more of the skillful members of the committee. So you can enter into a dialogue with your defilements and try to understand them. So that's using the self, not self, as you're dealing with concentration practice. And there's finally discernment. The discernment when you reach the point where, okay, it's time now to let go of everything. And you've applied this 5-step program to all of the things that would pull you away from concentration. Until you realize, okay, there's one attachment that's left, and that's your attachment to the past. And this is where the Buddha says you start analyzing your concentration in terms of those aggregates, and you learn to apply the 3 perceptions of constancy, stress, not self, to them. And why do you do that? Because you want to see that, okay, even though the pleasure to which you're most attached in life is the concentration. It is fabricated. It has its drawbacks. And so you start applying that 5-step program to the concentration itself. It has its allure. There's a lot of pleasure that goes with it. There's also a sense of stability. And it's been useful as a means for getting past a lot of your defilements. But because it's fabricated, it's something that you have to keep going all the time. You have to keep working at it. Wouldn't it be good if there was something unfabricated? And the mind gets to a point where it realizes if it stays in the state of concentration, there's going to be stress. If it moves someplace else, there's going to be stress. What does it do? At this point, all your senses of self get stymied. The self as a consumer comes to the value judgment. Okay, enough of this. The self is the producer, stymied, where to go, what to do. The self is the commentator, has no idea what to do either. And this is when the mind stops fabricating. The first time this happens, it's just a brief period of time when there is no fabrication going on in the mind at all. There are no intentions because you're stymied. There's no place that you can attend. And that's when the deathless opens. In other words, you realize that if you think back in terms of the original question for discernment, what when I do it will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness. You realize that no long-term is no longer good enough. There's nothing that I can do that won't cause stress. And that leads to a moment of non-fabrication. The Buddha tries to develop this in that famous questionnaire where he asks the monks, when he goes down the list of the aggregates, is this aggregate constant or inconstant? Well, it's inconstant. If it's inconstant, is it easeful or stressful? Well, it's stressful because you're trying to find happiness there. It's like sitting on a chair with uneven legs. You're constantly having to tense up. So it's inconstant and stressful. Is it worth calling yourself? No, it ends in a value judgment, the judgment of dispassion. And then you apply that, you realize it's not just here in the present moment, but all the aggregates, past, present, and future, near and far. This applies to all of them as well. And the dispassion gets really, really radical at that point. And this is where, as I said this morning, you end up with the teaching on Sabbe Dhammanata, all dhammas are not self. And this applies not only to inconstant things, but even to your first experience of what is constant, which would be the deathless itself. Because if you latch onto that, and it is possible to have an attachment to that, it gets in the way of full awakening. So at this point, the Buddha says nothing is worth holding on to. And as I said, once you let go of all those other attachments, you realize you have one attachment left, but you have to relinquish, and that's the attachment to that discernment itself. That too has to be let go of, and then you're totally free. So this is what the teaching on that self is supposed to lead you. The Buddha is not trying to define what you are. In fact, he's telling you your attachment to what you are, or what you think you are, is part of the problem. But he's also saying you can take that sense of what you are and train it so that it can actually become part of the path. And then once it takes it as far as it can go, okay, then you can be set free. But it's not trying to put you in a box. He's trying to show you put yourself in a box. Because that passes where he says, however you define yourself, you limit yourself. Here he's saying there's a way you can find a happiness where you don't have to define yourself. As long as you are looking for happiness, you're having to define yourself that's capable of finding and enjoying it. But once you've found the ultimate happiness, you can let all those desires go. You can let go of all strategies. The teachings on self and not self, then you put them aside. But when that's going on, you pick them up, put them down. As I've said many times, arahants know when they're eating whose mouth to put the food in. But they don't develop a lot of unskillful thoughts and attachments around that path. They use whatever abilities they still have after awakening to help the world. And then when the time comes to go, they go without any sense of regret, without any sense of lack. Because that true happiness that they've found is not affected by whatever happens to the 6 sense spheres, whatever happens to the body. It's something totally unfabricated. So that's what not self-teaching is all about. That's what it's for. And I hope that these comments have been helpful. I look forward to hearing any questions you may have.
All right. I can once again maybe reiterate the comments that Steve made in the morning about asking questions. In order to ask a question, so please raise the raise hand button, which you will see either in the bottom right if you are using a computer, or if you're using an iPad or such a mobile device, you will see it under the more options on the top right. I'll call out participants to ask questions in turn, and as Ajaan Geoff finishes answering your question, please lower your hand. Thank you. All right, we can start with Olivia.
Hello, Ajaan Geoff and everyone. Ajaan Geoff, in terms of self and not self, I think I have a pretty clear understanding of self, in the sense that if I'm ever producing or doing an action that is skillful and is going to take me up to another level, that's skillful, that's a good sense of self. But in terms of not self, I've been kind of confused in its application. And this is what I've come up with. So if you can correct me if I'm right or wrong, that would be useful. I kind of see it in two ways, not self. One, in the beginning of the practice, it's almost like if I'm meditating and there's a distraction that comes in, there's a possibility to run with the distraction, or to say, or if it's connected with the body, for instance, you can say that's not self and try to move away from it, come back to the breath. So that would be at level one, turning a sense of self into a not self. And I think I understand from what you just said that as the practice matures, that this sense of not self is not just moving away from it, but there's a deeper understanding of everything in terms of the three perceptions, maybe the noble truths, that makes it clear to see that it's not self. And now and then that becomes quite clear in certain instances, but not all the time. And I was just wondering if that would be the right approach. Because not self really kind of confuses me quite often.
Okay, well, you're right. In the beginning, that you're going to be just basically deciding, I'm going to move the boundary of myself, what I've been claiming to be myself. I will remove the boundary back or forward as is necessary, so that the area of not self includes things that I used to lay claim to. But you can move that boundary as an act of will. But if there's part of you that, members of the committee that still want to go back and lay claim to that, you'll be this constant back and forth. And that's when you have to start using the analysis, the 5 steps, and then seeing things in terms of three perceptions, the Four Noble Truths, so that you really understand why it was that you wanted to lay claim to it to begin with.
Yeah.
And that's a different kind of not self.
Yes, and I think also one line that you mentioned just today is that at that stage, the more mature way of practicing is indicative of not defining yourself at all.
Ultimately, yes.
Ultimately, yes. Thank you, Ajaan Geoff.
Robert?
Hello. So you mentioned directed thought and evaluation. I guess I was just wondering exactly how I use that within meditation. What form kind of does it take? Am I sort of speaking to myself? Am I investigating something? Like I guess exactly what's the most skillful way of using of using that within meditation?
Well, it's basically talking to yourself and saying, and asking some questions and trying to find some answers. And in the meditation, of course, the questions are, is the mind able to settle down with the breath? Is the problem with the breath? Is the problem with the mind? And then you try experimenting with different things, coming up with different ideas of, well, let's try this, let's try that. See what works to get the mind and the breath to get together. So it is kind of like an internal conversation. When people come to me sometimes and say, how do I start doing directed thought and evaluation? Is that you're doing it all the time already. It's simply a matter now of using it so it's useful and getting the mind to settle down.
Thank you.
All right. Helen?
Thank you. Hello, Ajaan. I'm seeking some instruction. Are you able to hear me?
A little bit, yeah. It's a little muffled, but otherwise I'll try.
Muffled. Is that better?
Okay, great.
That's better?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to seek your thoughts on an experience that I had maybe about a week ago that has been revisiting me, not purposefully, but has been revisiting me. Reaching my hand out to a doorknob, and there was this consciousness that said to me, I suppose, watch this. And I turned the doorknob and went through the door, and it felt like it dragged out for minutes. The lesson went on for minutes. In my mind, it was just a few seconds. And as I went through the door, I became aware that there was some consciousness that the contact that I made with the doorknob was the same contact as I make with anything and relate to all aggregates, which is I would not hold on to that doorknob while I'm trying to close the door behind me, that I wouldn't think to do that. It would be inappropriate, it would be unnecessary. It's not even something I need to be concerning myself with. I just wouldn't do it because my arm would get hurt and the door wouldn't get closed and I wouldn't be able to move. And there was something that almost literally said, watch this, know this, that all contacts are the doorknob, that all aggregates are the doorknob, unheld, whether I know it or not, they already are. And it felt like an important extended moment of knowing non-contact, non-clinging, non-contact but non-clinging. And there have been times since then that has sort of floated back to me in awareness and then gone. And then there have been times when I have felt myself in a contact and revisited that awareness purposefully, consciously, in order to not cling and not to cling to any aggregates. And I just wondered if you have any thoughts on whether the revisiting it is clinging or whether that's helpful for my instruction to myself going forward, my encouragement going forward.
Okay, well, the question you always ask with an insight like that is, when is this useful and when is this not useful?
Mm-hmm.
And again, there will be times when it'll be good. It'll be a good thing to remember. But okay, if I need to touch the doorknob in order to open the door. But if I hold on to the doorknob as I close the door, I'm going to break my arm. And try to see which attachments this is appropriate to think about. There'll be other times when the insight is not appropriate, and that's going to be a measure of your wisdom and discernment, and figure out, when do I apply this insight, when do I not.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Jared?
Hi, Ajaan. what type of lifestyle, sense restraint, and seclusion does a layperson need to regularly enter jhana?
Okay, minimal internet, minimal media outside. Aside from that, just being very careful. Sense restraint doesn't mean you don't look at things or listen to things. It just means you're very careful as you go through the day. And is greed doing the looking? Is anger doing the looking? Is lust doing the looking? If so, I've got to learn how to look in different ways. In other words, you're keeping your mind on a short leash as you go through the day. You're not tying it down, but you keep it on a short leash so it doesn't go wandering off very far.
All right, thank you.
All right, Valentine.
Ajaan, so I've noticed that some texts seem to imply that this, the knower, the awareness and the observer, the knower, is kind of the true self, but that's wrong. No, it's still a fabrication.
Right.
Because sometimes, I mean, like the awareness, this awareness persists after death somehow, but it doesn't seem right. I mean,
no. I mean, you're going to have to, as long as you're taking rebirth, it's a sign that you're still holding on. I mean, you're still creating this being out of the five aggregates. The knower here, of course, would be consciousness. Mm-hmm. And as long as you keep on attaching to the five aggregates, you're going to keep the process going. Eventually you're going to have to let go of that in order to gain awakening.
I see.
But then, as I said, once you gain awakening, the question of what's the self and what's not the self. John Swa once had a great comment on that. He said, once you attain the great, the ultimate happiness, you're not going to be concerned about who's experiencing this or if there's nobody experiencing or anybody's experiencing. It just is on itself. It's sufficient in and of itself. That's when you can put those questions aside.
Thank you.
Jim Wilcher.
Hi, Ajaan. You gave an example, a visual actually, of a circle with what's inside being what we're fabricating or choosing to be our self, and what's unhelpful to be outside. And that was really helpful. And so this is just always in regards to the five aggregates?
Any sense of self, although the Buddha would probably say that it's when you have a sense of self, one of the five aggregates at least is going to be involved.
Okay, and would it be a practice to focus on the five aggregates as opposed to kind of just a willy-nilly potpourri approach?
Yeah, I mean that's the Buddha gives you that focus because after all, it's clinging to those five aggregates. That constitutes a suffering.
Excellent, thank you.
And if you find that five aggregates is too many, focus on one.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you.
Jules.
Ajaan, thank you for this talk. I have a question about when you're doing something that you care about the results for. You want to do it well or correctly, like a house repair, or you have to deal with a government agency to correct a mistake that they made, and it's also can be stressful because there's always glitches that happen, and sometimes there's glitches that are not, it's generated by someone or something else. So in this case, in these cases, how do you not feel attached to what you're doing, but still want to do it well?
Okay. Just tell yourself, I could die before this whole process is done, so I better make sure my mind is in good shape.
Okay.
And as long as I have the opportunity to continue with this, okay, I'll try to do it well. But there may come a time when I just have to let it go, and kind of drop it. So, but I always maintain the idea, I do want to do this well, and this is something I want to succeed at. but I have to have sometimes when I can let that down so I can give the mind a rest.
Thank you.
Alex?
Thank you, Ajaan. Just wanted to go back to my question from the first session about the fourth tetrad of Anapanasati. So my understanding is that you are abandoning the hindrances and developing the factors for awakening. So how does inconstancy apply to, say, drowsiness and restlessness? In terms of, well, how would you apply the three perceptions to, say those hindrances? And is it the case that once the hindrances are sort of subside and the enlightened factors are fully developed, then you would apply the same three perceptions to the factors for awakening?
Right. I mean, you have to say, okay, what is it that's making me drowsy? And sometimes, of course, drowsiness comes from the fact that the body's really tired and you kind of get some rest. Other times, though, you find, you get up from the meditation, all of a sudden you have lots of energy. It's okay. What's going on here? Could sit back down again. Okay, what's the issue? Why is my mind telling me that when I'm sitting meditating, I'm drowsy, but I get up, I'm not drowsy? That's the kind of thing you want to look into. What am I attached to? What does the mind want right now that it's feeling frustrated about? And then learn how to see that as inconstant and unreliable. Because that's what inconstancy is all about. It's not so much things are impermanent, it's that they're unreliable. Okay. So where we can see that a defilement is based on what's unreliable, then that helps you get past that defilement.
Okay, thank you. Shanae and Justin.
Hi, John.
Good afternoon. My question is, when you were speaking about the Buddha talking about having a mature approach to mistakes, is there a specific area or a specific list that he would refer to expand on within that mature approach, how to recover from said mistake?
Okay, well, there's that sutta where he says, if you reflect on the fact that you did something that you regret, you realize you can't go back. No matter how guilty you feel, your guilt feelings will not be able to undo what you did. And the best course of action is to, one, resolve that you're not going to repeat that mistake again. And then two, lots of goodwill. Find all the brahma-viharas for yourself, for the people you wronged, and for everybody in general. Goodwill for yourself so that you're not just beating yourself up all the time. Goodwill for the people you harmed, and may we not have any more karma like that together. And then for all beings in general, so you remind yourself, okay, I've got to keep the well-being of everybody in mind if I want to make sure I don't repeat this mistake.
Thank you.
But yeah, lots in the brahma-viharas.
And, I have a more out there question. There's a famous author who I won't give free promotion to, who in his books, he's a fantasy writer and he has like magic systems and stuff. And in his metaphysics of his universe, there's a key where if I cast a spell in a certain magic system, like nobody else can interfere with it because it belongs to them. So in our universe, which there was a Buddha, in which there are awakened beings, like it seems like, I don't know if I can even say this, but the awakening seems to be key to them. But the Buddha, it's not a place where he wants us to go, right? He doesn't want us to try to figure out if there's an entity behind the awakening. Like when the Buddha got awakened, I didn't get awakened with him.
Right.
So I'm not going to say there's a self, but is there something?
Yes, as long as you're functioning as a being, you're going to have a sense of self, right?
Yes.
The only people who are not beings are arhants, because you're defined by your defilements. You're defined by your attachments, and what you're trying to do is learn how to get undefined.
So is it kind of like turning off a computer program?
Turning off the computer.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Thank you, Tana John.
Thank you.
Aileen, I'm sorry if I'm saying your name wrong.
No, that's fine. Eileen, thank you, Tana John, and everyone at the Parisā and the Sati Center for having this session. My question is probably kind of elementary, but I'm thinking about how to be more aware of the process of I making and my making, and is it that if I think, oh, I want some tea or I need to take a shower, that's I making too, or if I want my friend to be happy, is that I making? I'm not really sure what it in my daily life what it sounds like in my mind.
Okay. That's kind of innocent I making and my making, and there will be a little bit of a world around that sense of I. But those things, the things you're talking about, are really innocent. We're talking about what the Buddha is more concerned about is the I making and my making that really start causing trouble, causing suffering. But basically, it goes around. You have a desire, and there's a sense of you who wants to attain that thing, and there's a you who's going to enjoy that thing once you attain it. And as the Buddha starts out by saying, you can't just say, well, I won't have any desires at all. You say, okay, let me learn how to desire what is skillful, and create some more eyes around skillful desires to be generous, to be virtuous, to follow the path. And then you begin to realize that you've got this whole stable of eyes that you've been making in the past. And you come running up against someone sometimes. They'll come up and say, well, I would rather do this. No, I would rather do that. And you say, well, is this really where I want to go? This is how you become more conscious of the I making and my making when there's the two eyes start fighting.
Thank you. That's what I was trying to figure out, how to be more conscious of it when it's happening.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Victoria?
Yes, thank you. I am up against a really difficult problem where I'm a professional musician, and I've dedicated my whole life to music, and my goal has always been to not have a self at all, to be selfless, to be a kind of transparent vessel, so that whatever was originally intended by the composer can be transmitted without any mediation from me. And it's a very unpopular approach, especially nowadays, but I've adhered to it, and I believe in it strongly. And I'm just, I don't know if it's old age or what it is, but I've been trying to keep my mind on a short leash. But right now I'm up against, I'm doing some music that is very important to me. I'm performing it, and I'm going to be performing it in a few days, and I cannot stay in the music. My mind is racing to just inane. It's almost like somebody replaced my brain with like a monkey, well, the monkey mind or the puppy, and I don't know what happened. I don't know how that came about. I mean, I've had a long career, and I don't know, but the self, non-self, I keep trying to just return to the music, but somehow it's like there's something in rebellion. And I don't know if this is too esoteric a question.
No, it's not. You might want to ask this mind or say, what are you rebelling against? Is it something in the music you're rebelling against? Is this particular piece, or is it all the music that you're performing right now?
No, this is the greatest music, I think, that has ever been composed. And I've always revered it, and I've performed it before. And so I feel like I'm unworthy suddenly, that it's not, I don't know, like my mind, I feel like it's beginner's mind in the worst way. And the sense of like this self or whatever it is that's interfering.
Okay, we've got to sit down and talk with it. So really, have an inner conversation. Okay, what's the issue? What's the problem? What are we up against here? And see what kind of conversation you're going to have.
With myself?
With yourself, yeah. Okay. What is it that I'm not admitting to myself about? And again, this is where it's useful to think about the mind as a committee.
Oh, that's why I wanted to ask you, the committee, right? The committee has gone totally out of control here.
Yeah, okay. Who in the committee is leading the rebellion? And why are they feeling that their needs are not being met?
Wow. Can I come up and see you at Valley Center and discuss
Sure.
this? I have no idea where to start with this. Okay. I don't know how to have that conversation, but I don't want to take up any more time from others. So, all right. Well,
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, Ajaan, I'll ask some of these questions that have been coming up. So I know there are two more questioners waiting in line, so please thank you for your patience. Can you please elaborate on the three functions of self, producer, consumer, commentator in the Pali Canon? Is there a sutta where all three functions are described together? What are the Pali terms for these? Alternatively, are these from different parts of the canon?
These are from different parts of the canon. These are simply the way I've observed how the Buddha talks about self in his various teachings. In some cases, the concern for the self is you want to provide for the happiness of the self. Well, that's thinking about the self as the consumer. Other times when you think about, I am capable of doing this, like the self as being its own mainstay, the self that says, other beings, other people can do this. They're human beings. I'm a human being. Why can't I do it? That is basically, you're thinking about the terms of the self as the producer. And the self as commentator is basically what the Buddha was teaching Rahula, is how to ask questions about your actions while you're doing them. So again, these terms are not, there's no specific term applied to them in the canon. It's simply my observation of how the Buddha's psychology, when he talks about self, how the psychology works.
Okay, thank you. How can we know for sure that we are in the stage of non-fashioning? How long does it take from the stage of non-fashioning to awakening?
When you stop fashioning, okay, there will be an awakening immediately. Because what's happening is what holds the present moment together is your intention in the present moment. And then when your experience of the six senses goes, and it's replaced by this knowing element that's not related to the six senses at all, okay, that's when you know that you've had a moment of non-passion.
Okay. Dear Ajaan, in the meditation, I could see self-forming and conceit arising along with it, but not able to say explicitly identifying any one or more of the aggregates as I am. Then to which aggregate should I focus and tell this is not me? Thank you.
Okay, I would start with perception, because the sense of I am is a kind of perception.
Okay. What are the three perceptions? This is another question. Three perceptions.
The Pali, anicca, dukkha, anatta. They're usually called the three characteristics. That's the term that was applied to them in the commentaries. In the canon, they're referred to as perceptions. Perception of anicca, inconstancy. Sometimes that's translated as impermanence, but the word anicca, it's the negative of nitya, which means constant. And it's not so much that things are impermanent, that's the problem. It's they're unreliable. Dukkha, I translate as stress. It's also translated as suffering. And then, of course, anatta is not self.
Thanks for this offer. Okay, that's a donation question. Okay. Yes, now I think Jeremy, if you'd like to ask your question.
My livelihood right now tends to come from orchestrating change in my organization across long time scales. And as I have studied dependent co-arising, I think I've come to discern that a lot of our issues tend to come from aggregation of defilements, if you will. And I've found success as I have started to apply what I have learned in meditation to how I approach our organization as an example. But what that's done for me, though, is I find that sometimes I find stress, and when I try to tease it apart during meditation and discern it, I find myself sometimes getting stuck on time. And then I pull out the 3 characteristics, and that goes nowhere. So I put a pin in that and move on to something more useful. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
So the issue is about time?
Yeah, I have yet to, if I am meditating and I find stress and I discern it back to the concept of time, I kind of come to an impasse, and I work through a different means to try to do something with the problem, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, well, is the question?
Yeah.
Is the question impatience around time, or just having too many narratives that does it like go back and forth into the past and future?
It's more so like I find stress, and say it's around a plan or something that is not tangible yet. Something it's a fabrication, and I'm trying to make fabrications a reality. And so time is a requirement there. And so sometimes as I try to discern where is the stress, what am I clinging to? Sometimes I almost perceive that I'm clinging to time, and I have yet to figure out how to apply the 3 characteristics there.
Okay, now this is where you have to basically say, I wouldn't apply 3 characteristics right there quite yet. I'd say more. I've got to get my mind under control and stop just certain types of thought which are not helpful right now, so that that's focused on the stressfulness of the thoughts, and they're getting in the way of my concentration. And so that particular narrative has to go. I have to, and whatever attachment I have to it, I have to tell myself, look, I cannot hold on to you right now, because you're interfering with something which I think is more important.
Okay, so ignoring that train of thought so far has been the correct course of action, I think.
Right.
Thank you.
All right, Tanajan, I think one more question has come separately to me, so I'll read out the question. This is a pretty interesting one. So it says, she had this question coming from your reading material, the Not Self Strategy, under section 6. It says that dispassion is an unfabricated phenomenon. And this person had the understanding that they could cultivate or fabricate dispassion by contemplating the 3 characteristics, the foulness of the body, etc.
Okay, you can. It's the contemplation is the means to the dispassion. Just like the path doesn't cause dispassion, but it leads there. Somebody's making noise.
I'm trying to see if I can mute them. This is Lynn. Okay, I'm just muting. Okay, please go ahead.
Okay. What you do in terms of the contemplation is part of the path. And this is why the Buddha used the image of a path. It's like the path to a mountain doesn't cause the mountain to be, but following the path will take you there. So in this case, you follow the path that will take you to dispassion. You're not causing dispassion. Dispassion is something that sort of is, as things drop away, that's the dispassion.
So it is because it is the nibbida that results from the 5 types of question.
Right. The 5 types of questioning that you're asking, and then comparing the drawbacks with the allure of whatever it is you're attached to.
Okay. Thank you. The other question this person is also asked is, what's the relationship between vijnana and as an aggregate, and vijnana anidassanam, or consciousness without surface?
They're 2 different things. Vijnana as an aggregate has to depend on the sense spheres, the sense media, and this vijnana as that is without surface is totally independent of the sense media.
Okay. Another question just came up. 5 types. Can you please repeat the 5 types of questions? No, 5 types of questions. Yeah.
Okay. First, you want to see, how does this thing originate? When it arises, what comes with it, what causes it. Secondly, you want to see that it passes away as the cause passes away. Third, if it comes back, you say, well, why am I going back for this again? What's the allure? What's attractive about this? What do I find compelling? And it can be either something you like about it or a sense of duty you may have around it, an obligation that you have to do this. And then the fourth one is seeing the drawbacks. And then the fifth is the result, which is there's going to be dispassion, and that's the escape.
Okay. Sean, so I just want to remind everyone there are just 5 more minutes left. So hopefully try to ask questions as briefly as you can to respect Tanajan's time. Tanajan, it's okay if we go over just 1 or 2 minutes? Okay.
Okay, I'll try to be as brief as possible then. Thank you, Ajaan, for your talk tonight. Well, tonight for me, at least, because I'm here in the UK. So you've talked in your talk today about the self as being a strategy for happiness. And for me, that connects to another statement from your book on discernment. We identify who we are by how we feel. And as long as we are unawakened beings, we will continue to create a sense of self, and we'll continue to feed. And wrapped up in that is the sense of vulnerability and anxiety because of the nature of the process. So I thought, so I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about how to address and handle that sense of vulnerability and anxiety that comes from feeding and that comes from selfing.
Okay, well, this is where you have to start developing the selfing around concentration. So you realize that you can support yourself mentally and emotionally more and more through the practice of the skill that you develop around concentration, so that when things outside change, as they inevitably will, you're not so threatened by them.
Okay. And do you feel that this is a place where the contemplation on refuge comes in as well?
Right. You're realizing that you're taking your refuge. As the Buddha said, you would take yourself as a refuge, and that means developing the establishing of mindfulness. And then establishing of mindfulness leads to concentration. So that's where you're going to be looking for a sense of stability in your life. Okay. More secure food source.
I'll do my best. Thank you.
Shanae and Justin.
Yeah, so in the March 1st talk on rebirth and not self, you were speaking about how the Buddha said that sometimes beings who do good have bad rebirths, and sometimes beings who do harmful things have good rebirths. And the Buddha said that it's because they develop. If you did well, if you did good, and then you had a bad rebirth, it was because you developed the wrong view. Now, initially, when I hear that, I think of somebody thinking like the Buddha is wrong, or awakening is not possible, or something like that, which is like a layup. Like, yes, that's a wrong view. But would worrying about your family members at death, would that be considered developing wrong view?
It wouldn't be wrong view, but it would be the kind of karma that would pull you down. And this is where you need somebody by your side to say, Justin, no. Don't worry about us. Remember that when the Buddha, there was that one, the guy who seemed to be on his deathbed, and his wife said, "Don't worry about me. If you're concerned that I'll go away from the Dharma, don't worry. Now that you're gone, I'll actually have more time to be with the Dharma." Okay, that's what you want.
Okay.
Noted.
Thank you, Judge. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Tanajan. I can't.
There's one more question, Balaji, that someone has. And I think this will close it well.
All right. Yes. Can you also repeat the one thing we should get from this talk, as you stated in the beginning?
Okay, the one thing is that the not self-teaching is not an attempt to define what you are or what you are not. It was not saying that there is no self. It's there to help you develop some dispassion for the various ways that you've been defining yourself. The problem is not what you are. The problem is your idea of what you are. But the Buddha's genius is it's going to take part of your problem, part of the way you define what you are, and make that part of the solution. In other words, learning how to train your sense of self so that it actually is focused on the path. And then from there, once you get to the end of the path, and then you can let go of both self and not self. Okay.
Thank you, Ajaan, for this fantastic Daylong.
Hope it's been helpful.
It is, and it's always very wonderful to hear you clarify such pervasive confusions. So thank you so much for all this. And yeah, Steve, do you want to make any closing comments or anything?
No, traditionally, I know in a lot of times we meet, we bow 3 times to 3 refuges, then 3 times in honor of Ajaan. So I think we should do that.
Yeah.
The end, okay?